out and placed.
A bird's nest.
It could be stretched out, but that doesn't impact why they could.
Brittany.
An argument for firemen.
Well,
This needs to come out of that.
Yeah, Bob Taylor took us 30 minutes for sound. We're optimistic we're going to have video by 11.
Are you needing video
No.
too? Okay.
Well, we're zooming, so hopefully they're getting.
We're fine with them just seeing the screen.
Okay, great.
Oh, yes, that's, yeah.
No photos of us are all they're getting.
Okay, sure.
I appreciate you guys waiting for us to get that figured out. All right, and if you guys have any questions, I will probably stay back here and monitor chat if we need it. And we also have audio, so you guys should be able to share questions, comments, things like that.
Okay, Bob or Kayla, if you could just give us a thumbs up if you can hear us and you can see the screen that says contact information.
And so also Rania is the one.
And Rania, if you could let us know that you're able to see the screen and hear us also, please.
I only hear you.
We might have to stop the share and then reshare it because sometimes that happens.
Screen
in
is
Zoom.
black. Okay.
Yeah.
So you said stop screen share and
Yep,
then.
and then reshare it.
Actually, just,
Sorry.
nope, actually, we could have done, there was an easier way to do that.
Oh.
but-
That's all right.
The PowerPoint one.
Not that one.
Gotcha. Okay.
There we go.
All right, and is the screen share working now? You can see the slide. All right.
You have to aim at the pencil on the desk.
Okay,
Because that's where the receiver is.
great. All right. Since they can't see us, I guess I can. So how many people do we have on? We have
Got
3.
Right now.
Okay. All right, well, obviously we're a bit late getting started, but we can go ahead and start. This is our contact information. If you scan the QR code that's up on the screen now for either one of us, you will get our business cards virtually, I guess, and then you can choose to connect with us by sending us your information if you wish. And we can, we also have this at the end of the presentation as well. So if you want to do it, then that's more than fine since we're late getting started here. Oh, you got to click on the slide for me. So maybe over here. There you go. Yeah. Okay, so this is a training that we've developed, and it's we've labeled it the Trinity model and how changing your model for effective leadership, decision-making, and culture can influence your workplace. I'll let Brian introduce himself, and then I'll come back to you.
My name is Brian Brauer. Ryan and I both work at a large university, but we're not speaking for that university today. I'm also not allowed to speak on behalf of my family. My wife, my kids, 2 of the 5 dogs will allow me to acknowledge them. Got a master's degree in global human resource education and a doctorate in EPOL. My dissertation topic looked at how culture can change in an emergency services organization after the line of duty death. And since completing my dissertation, that's the area that I've continued to do research and work in, is how to get culture to change in organizations that are resistant to change and have deeply rooted cultures. I've been involved in public safety since 1990. One of my projects I've done in the past decade was develop the National Safety Culture Change Initiative document for the U.S. Fire Administration under FEMA. I've also played a role in creating the strategic plan for the North American Fire Training Directors. And I chair the International Committee on Accreditation for firefighter training and certifications.
All right, so my name is Ryan Snow. I am a husband and father of 2 children, my wife Amy and 2 kids, Dylan and Drake. They are 4 and 6 years old, so I definitely have my my gray hair coming in a little bit faster these days than typical. I have a master's degree in educational leadership and was just accepted into the doctoral program for educational policy and organizational leadership, so I'm pretty excited about starting that journey. I've been a police officer for 13 years, and during that time I got a certification known as a drug recognition expert instructor certification. It's a extremely special certification. There's only about 25 officers in the entire state of Illinois that have that certification. So I've been extremely blessed in that aspect of my career. I serve on the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police Impaired Driving Subcommittee, which looks at ways that the state of Illinois can reduce the impaired driving issues. I'm an instructor at the Police Training Institute, where new recruits from all around the state that get hired by different towns, counties, organizations like that for police services send their police recruits to get their initial training. And I've been a contributing author 2 different times, so that was really fun for me. A couple different books on drug and alcohol prevention and just leadership in general. So, okay. We start off by just kind of giving you our mission statement. We're going to talk a little bit about mission, vision, values, and methods within this presentation. And so the first thing we really want to do is just kind of talk a little bit about our mission statement. And the mission for Fire and Ice is to empower individuals, teams, and organizations to become honest, inclusive, empathetic, and powerful leaders driving positive change in their fields through engaging in powerful learning experiences. That is our mission, and that's what we strive to do whenever we provide presentations like this. This is a Zoom situation. We don't have actually anybody besides Annabelle. Thank you for being here, Annabelle. That was really nice of you. We don't have anybody in the room except for Annabelle, so we'll just be doing this through Zoom. So obviously you can, I guess, police yourselves, and if you need to leave, leave. And we're gonna probably skip most of the breaks here, just because we are doing it Zoom and we get started a little bit later. So there we go. Some of the disclaimers that we have built into this presentation. We're, like Brian said, we're speaking on our individual capacity. We are in no way, shape, or form speaking for or on behalf of our employers. Me and Brian actually have multiple employers. That's something we probably have something going wrong with us because we've taken so many jobs we can barely breathe at this point, but it's fun and we enjoy it. So our experience and research we're going to be talking about is our own, and it's the experiences that we've had researching this and gathering other people's information as well. We're going to throw some of those ideas in here. So that's how we're going to do that. The limitations on this is it's important to note that the information we're going to give is not just going to solve every issue you're seeing within your organization. So some of the techniques presented are intended for consideration, and they may yield varying results, obviously. And then the intellectual property, we just want to make sure that none of the property within this presentation is reproduced or distributed without our permission. We will give you access to the slides after the presentation is complete. We can send those to Annabelle and she can send them out through a email if you guys wish to receive those. Just let her know. Bottom line up front is we are sharing thoughts we've compiled over a combined 45 years in public service. You'll recognize many of the concepts. Like I said, there's famous authors and people in here that you're going to recognize some of the concepts, but what we're looking to do is just connect some of the older ideas in a new way for you. Okay, we're not experts, we're coaches. We'd like to just guide you to see and unlocking your own potential with some of the concepts that we're going to introduce. Oh gosh, Zoom is going nuts. Holy cow. Let me give it a minute. There we go. Oh gosh, it's crazy. Could you, that one. 2 ways we learn. Annabelle's gonna be my clicker now, so
Okay.
that's really helpful. Traditional learning. So traditional learning provides the ability to do just more with the tools you already have. The idea of traditional learning is you'd come into a classroom, you'd learn an idea, but you just apply that to the skills you already possess. It deepens your understanding of the capabilities and functionalities of your existing tools and empowers you to leverage the current resources you have just a little bit more effectively. The way that we would like to introduce some information is to you is through some transformational learning. We're going to potentially offer you a completely different set of tools to choose from. We want to provide you some methodologies, frameworks, techniques that'll work, expand your repertoire of problem-solving approaches, and then get you to really understand that the way you're looking at problems is not the only way to look at problems throughout your organization. There may be other options you have. So we want to completely kind of stand that issue on its head and look at it from a whole new angle so that we're able to enhance your ability to analyze and identify those challenges from new angles.
Next slide. An example of transformational learning is the experience that President Roosevelt had. When Roosevelt was an adult, he contracted polio. At the time he contracted polio, he'd already been the Secretary of the Navy. He was a prominent leader in the Democrat Party, part of New York's elite social circles. When he contracted polio, he went to Warm Springs, Georgia to recover. This is before he was governor of New York, before he was president. And he was exposed to a life in Warm Springs and exposed to people that he'd never met before. He was exposed to people that didn't have running water in their homes, people that didn't have electricity, people that didn't have enough food to eat. And that experience changed Roosevelt's outlook on the world. And that experience is credited with why, once he became governor and later president, he was so strongly pushing social programs that would help all Americans live up to their potential and not just the ones who had the means. So that's an idea of, he had one idea going to this place and had a different idea coming away. But what we're going to go over the course of the morning is we're going to talk about 4 concepts. We're going to talk about what makes up effective leadership. We're going to talk about decision-making and a couple of different models of decision-making, organizational culture, and communication. We're then going to look at how do you solve problems by applying these concepts. We're going to start by talking about Kodak. In the chat, if you could please identify what do you think about when I say the name Kodak? What comes to mind? We'll give that a second for you to populate in the chat. Yeah, Kodak was the first company to make cameras. So yeah, and you guys are going exactly where we're going to go. Kodak was an organization that focused on the stuff to run cameras and make film. The idea that George Eastman had in the 1880s when Kodak was founded was to put a camera in the hand of everyone on the planet and let them be available to take their own pictures. That worked well until competition came into the market. In 1935, Kodak came up with their first patent for color film, Kodachrome film. In World War II, Kodak provided a very unique service where, because it was so much lighter to take pictures of letters, send the film from Europe back to the United States, develop those pictures, and then send the mail that way to loved ones, That's one of the services Kodak offered during World War II. My grandfather was one of the folks that worked in Flushing, New York to develop that V-mail, that victory mail, those letters from the European front that were then developed and shared back with loved ones at home. Kodak is the place where we went to. Every Christmas, we would go and have our picture taken at the Kodak factory where my grandfather worked. Kodak actually had the first patent on digital photography, which is kind of amazing to think about because that was in 1975. And even though they had the very first patent on digital photography, out of all the photographic companies, Kodak resisted moving towards digital photography. They used what was referred to as the razor and blade model. They figured you would buy their camera once, but you would buy their film and all of their other products multiple times. So they were very heavily invested on you buying their paper, you buying their chemicals. Or some of you may be old enough to remember when you would take the cartridge of film and drop it off and have to get it developed anywhere from an hour to a couple of days later. That's not how we get cameras or use cameras today. We have a camera in our pocket. We've realized George Eastman's idea. However, for many people, it's no longer using a Kodak product. Kodak started the struggle in the 80s when Fujifilm came on the market. At the time, Kodak had a 90% market share in camera sales, film sales, and sales of the chemicals and paper. Printed on Kodak paper used to be a badge of honor for a company to be able to develop their photos. But in 1980, Fujifilm came on the market and they were offering film at a 20% reduced rate. Their paper was less expensive, but the same quality. Kodak didn't adapt. Kodak stayed focused on wanting to stay in the space where people had to buy their paper, buy their chemicals, buy their film, and they didn't react to the changing marketplace. On our phones now, in our pockets, we can take a panoramic picture. We can take a portrait. We can take a normal photo. Kodak didn't adapt to those ideas with digital photography, even though they had the patent. They made a whole different camera you had to buy with a cartridge you had to send to them to develop. They then tried to branch into the printer market, which was wildly expensive for them, and their printers never competed as well with others on the market. Nowadays, Kodak doesn't have the market it did. And Kodak's a great example of a company that has issues with its leadership, communications, decision-making, and organizational culture that led them from being a market leader into a company that struggled to come out of a bankruptcy in 2012. So those four concepts, leadership, communication, culture, and decision-making, are what's going to drive the rest of the presentation. We're going to talk about each of those concepts individually and then talk about where they have some overlap. We're going to start by talking about leadership. Then we'll go to decision-making, then culture, and then we'll wrap up with communication. One of our favorite quotes is from Peter Drucker, that only three things happen naturally in an organization. Friction, which is that tension between individuals, ideas, confusion, which is when communication doesn't happen effectively, and underperformance. Everything else, all of the positives of an organization require leadership. The art of leadership is getting people to do willingly what you want them to do, but giving them the impression that they've done it themselves. You may not have to convince people it's their idea. If they buy into the mission, vision, values, and methods of your organization, they're there willing to be led. But how do you get them to leave their impression, their fingerprints on the work while still performing the work that your organization wants to do? That's where we're going to focus on our discussions of leadership. We're going to do an exercise where we'd like you to drop in the chat, what are some of the characteristics that you think make a good leader? Just please put one or two of those items into the chat.
Transparency. Good communication and clear expectations. Honesty.
So far, Kayla and Bob, you've each hit on terms that we've already got the slides in the deck. We're not changing them as you're typing. But those are some of the values that are really important to us also. So where we want to go with leadership is we want to talk about how to lead at a strategic level. It's very, very easy for all of us to focus on the things that made us successful in a previous position and keep doing those things. But we've all been promoted because our organization identified that we used to do something well, and now they want us to lead that function, be in charge of that function, or help other people achieve their potential and accomplish the work of the organization. So we're going to talk about what is a mission, what's a vision, what are values, and some of the things you typed: transparency, honesty. Those are values that are going to play a role in how individuals become a part of your organization and how you lead a team of people to accomplish things. We're also going to talk about methods, which are kind of the how behind the mission, vision, and values. We're then going to talk about some of the differences between managers and leaders and talk about some of the challenges you might encounter as a leader. So mission, vision, and values. We'll start with what is our mission? When we talk about mission, what we're asking is, what do we do? What do we do as an organization? And we're going to give you a couple examples of that. To get to the what you do, starting with why, starting with Simon Sinek's golden circle is important, because knowing your why will help you determine what the mission is, what the vision is, and what the values are. So here's Simon Sinek talking about finding your why.
World's simplest idea. I call it the golden circle. This little idea explains why some organizations and some leaders are able to inspire where others aren't. Every single person, every single organization on the planet knows what they do 100%. Some know how they do it, but very, very few people or organizations know why they do what they do. By why, I mean, what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? And why should anyone care? The inspired leaders and the inspired organizations all think, act, and communicate from the inside out. Let me give you an example. If Apple were like everyone else, a marketing message from them might sound like this: we make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? Meh. That's how most marketing is done. That's how most sales is done. We say what we do. We say how we're different or how we better, and we expect some sort of behavior, a purchase, a vote, something like that. Here's how Apple actually communicates. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? People don't buy what you do, people buy why you do it. The goal is not to do business with everybody who needs what you have. The goal is to do business with people who believe what you believe. Again, the goal is not just to sell people who need what you have. The goal is to sell to people who believe what you believe. If you hire people just because they can do a job, they'll work for your money. But if you hire people who believe what you believe, they work for you with blood and sweat and tears. Something called the law of diffusion of innovation. The first 2.5% of our population are our innovators. The next 13.5% of our population are our early adopters. The next 34% are your early majority, your late majority, and your laggards. That if you want mass market success or mass market acceptance of an idea, you cannot have it until you achieve this tipping point between 15 and 18% market penetration. So it's this here, this little gap that you have to close. Because you see, the early majority will not try something until someone else has tried it first. And these guys, the innovators and the early adopters, they're more comfortable making those intuitive decisions that are driven by what they believe about the world and not just what product is available. These are the people who stood online for 6 hours to buy an iPhone when they first came out. Leaders hold a position of power or authority, but those who lead inspire us. And it's those who start with why that have the ability to inspire those around them.
One of the ideas that Ryan and I like for figuring out that mission is not only starting with why, but starting with the vision of what success looks like. The picture up on the screen is one of my mentors. It's Colonel Richard Janey. Colonel Janey is a Navy Cross recipient, and he was the first U.S. Marine Corps leader to be the commandant of the NATO school, which is a joint U.S.-European training facility in Europe. He helped build and design the school when he was a captain. And as a colonel, he was the first Marine Corps officer to lead that facility. When Dick retired from the Marine Corps, he came to work at the State Fire Academy in Illinois, where I had the privilege of being his first full-time position he hired, and I worked for him for just under 12 years. We met with Dick earlier this month at his home down in Lower Alabama, and we talked to him about mission, vision, and values. And one of the points that he brought up was start with success, that when you are thinking about what your mission is, make sure you're including what success looks like. What do you want to know, be, or do? What do you want people in your organization to understand? What do you want the public to understand about what your organization does? So having that vision in mind helps you not only have the why that Cynic mentions, but also the what do you want to become? When you lead towards the mission, our role as leaders is to articulate what that main effort is for the team. We then have to make sure we allocate resources. And there's only 3 resources we really have control of in most of our settings: people, time, and money. And because a lot of us are state employees, you have more of the former, enough of the middle, and never enough of the latter to make sure you're supporting whatever that main effort is. But our job as leaders is often to point back to what's important for the folks that are in our charge. We need to remind folks sometimes why it is we're doing what it is we're doing. Here's an example of a mission statement from the Boy Scouts. They identify their mission as preparing young people to make ethical and moral choices over their lifetime by instilling in them the values of the Scout Oath and Law. I use this example, one, because I have a background as a youth in Scouts and also as an adult, having served as a Scout Master for 10 years, but also because this is a great example of a mission incorporating values into that statement of what the mission is. So it not only addresses the what, which is to prepare young people to make ethical and moral choices over their lifetime, but it also goes into the how, which is by instilling certain values into those individuals. Your organizations have a mission statement, and this is an opportunity to think about what that mission statement is. Maybe print it out, keep it handy. When I worked at the Fire Academy for 20 years, I kept a copy of our mission, which was to help firefighters do their work through training, education, information, and research. And I kept that in a prominent place in my office because it helped me make decisions. When I wondered if something was a project I should work on or not, I just had to turn to that mission and identify is what I'm thinking about doing attached to one of those 4 principles. Another example of a mission statement comes from the Dallas Fire Department. Their mission is to prevent and suppress fires. That's kind of a given if you've got the big red trucks. Educate and rescue citizens, provide emergency medical services, promote public safety, and foster community relations. I use this one as an example because most fire departments stop at the first comment. They look at their mission as to save lives and protect property, but they don't go deeper into the prevention activities. In many fire departments, even though the majority of what they provide is emergency medical services, some of them up to 80% emergency medical services, they don't acknowledge that as a part of their mission. They focus on training for fires most of the time, when most of their responses are actually emergency medical services. That's a great example of where the mission may need to change because the organization has changed. The customer needs have changed, but the mission hasn't changed with it. Vision is a little different than mission. Vision is what do we want to achieve? And I like using the term vision because a good vision has that visual. And we're going to give you a couple examples of that. First, we're going to look at the presentation that John F. Kennedy gave at Rice University. This was a significant speech because this was the first time he laid out that we're going to go to the moon. There have been ideas that maybe we could. When we play this clip, what I want you to listen to is first, how does he set it up? How does he acknowledge where the country was in 1962? How does he acknowledge the difficulty of what it's going to take to go to the moon? And then how does he pitch the idea? How does he generate enthusiasm from the audience to want to do this? We're going to let this clip play through, but listen for those 3 points.
William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulty, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
1962 was that speech. Kennedy he died a year later. And in 1969, we landed on the moon. That's especially impressive because it's estimated that 40% of the technology that was necessary to get to the moon hadn't been invented yet. And another 20% of the technology that did exist wasn't at a size that it was scaled down enough to fit to go to the moon. Fast forward now, 2023, the computer that we carry in our pocket has more processing speed than the lunar lander and the rescue capsule that were part of the Apollo program. That's a huge jump in technology. You also need to look at what that vision did, not only for the space program, but for you have to look at what it did not only for the space program to get us to the moon, but how some of the technology that's come about from the space program has helped in our everyday life. Everything from the bulletproof vests that police wear, the fire-resistant clothing that race car drivers and firefighters wear. All of those things are a result of the innovations that came in place as we tried to develop the new technologies to go to the moon. The move from vacuum tubes to transistors was a huge part of that effort because vacuum tubes were too large and too fragile to put in spaceships and have them functional after liftoff. So that vision of we're going to go to the moon enabled us to grow as a country, not just get from the Earth to the moon. It enabled us to get to today with new technologies. Take a look at the mission and vision for your organization. How do you keep those in front of the people in your organization? And how do you connect your decisions and the activities in your organization in that alcohol and other drug space back to that mission? How do you use your mission and vision as a way to determine if an activity is something you should do or not? We're going to go to another clip that's a little more recent. And we're going to take a look at how President Reagan articulated a vision. Like Kennedy, he's articulated a challenge. He's going to articulate a challenge specifically to Premier Gorbachev.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I showed that clip to my kids. My kids are 23, 25, and 27. And they were all confused because it said West Germany on the video clip. From a vision standpoint, that was a successful challenge that Reagan gave, because my kids know of a country called Germany. Whereas when I was in school, there was an East Germany and a West Germany. That's the power of a vision, power of a challenge. The challenge of we're going to go to the moon, the challenge of Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. What are those challenges that you can offer to your staff and tie back to your organization's mission and vision? Here's another example of a vision statement. This is also from Dallas Fire Rescue: to be the best trained, technologically advanced, customer-focused fire service organization in the country. There's some aspects there that are not things you typically associate with the work of firefighting. Being a firefighter is difficult, heavy lifting, back-breaking work. There's a lot of crawling and carrying things, dragging hoses, throwing ladders. And here they start with the importance of technology, something that the fire service typically rebels against. Can you understand what the vision of this organization is, or what they want to be? Notice how the vision, like Reagan and Kennedy's comments, has superlatives in it. It has things that are not easily measurable. It's not the purpose of a vision to be easily measurable. It's the purpose of the vision to point to the horizon and help guide your team, to give something for you to point to when it's time to motivate your team, when people are struggling, or when it comes to time to evaluate your employees, to make sure that individuals are focused on the right aspects of their job in your organization. Here's another example of a vision. Now, when I was told this story, it was treated as a fact, as things so often are. I've since not been able to find any proof that this story is true, but because I found 4 other versions of the same story, I'm going to assume it's not. But the story goes very far to illustrate what a vision is. The story goes that in the 1300s, this cathedral at Cambridge University, King's Cathedral, was built. And the whole upper section of the church is made out of oak, old growth oak trees, the kind of trees that have to grow for 150 years before you can cut them down for lumber. That was in the 1300s. Those beams in the church go untouched till the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, all the way up to the 2000s. when there's an infestation of beetles in those oak beams, and all of those beams are going to have to be replaced. That's when the leadership and the architect of the cathedral asked, where are we going to find old growth oak trees to replace these beams? Turns out they just had to go out the back door of the cathedral, across the churchyard cemetery, into a grove of trees that had been planted at the same time the church was built. The church was built in 1300. Acorns were planted in 1300. And 700 years later, they were able to harvest those trees to replace all of the woodwork inside the church. Not necessarily a true story, but a story that illustrates what a vision is. Take a look at the vision of your organization and compare it against the items that are up on the slide. Does it motivate you? Does it engage not only your mind where you can understand what the words are, but does it make you want to do something? Does the vision of your organization make you want to come to work every day? Does it make what you do feel important? Does it describe something that's worthwhile? Does it lay out a plan of what you're going to do? Is it fulfilling the work you do every day? If your vision isn't doing those things, there's no rule that says you can't take your organization's vision and refine it to be more specific or motivating to your team. You can translate it to help your team understand what's expected of them. You can make sure that that vision is measurable or attainable, and then use that vision as part of your employee performance reviews. And lastly, is your vision adaptable over time? Your vision can't be something that just sits on the shelf or hangs on the wall. One of the organizations I was a part of, there were different versions of the vision hanging throughout the building. Some of them had 3 values and 5 sentences. Others had 5 values and 3 sentences. Which one is right? It's important that we make sure the vision is modern, it reflects what we want to do now and into the future, and that we're consistent with our messaging of that vision across the organization. The next piece is values. Our values are, what do we stand for? What are the things that we believe in? Some places refer to these as core values. Bob and Kayla, when you guys typed in things like transparency earlier, honesty, those are examples of values. Those are the things that are important to your organization. Values can be expressed a number of ways. They can be principles and standards. For example, service above self, which is Rotary's motto that expresses their values. Do a good turn daily. Back to that Boy Scout example. They can be ethical guidelines, like the Hippocratic Oath, the 10 Commandments, the Outdoor Code. They can be a conceptual framework or a collection of ideas. For example, the Helsinki Accord. As part of that process of Mr. Gorbachev taking down that wall, the US and Russia had to address the escalating arms race and end the Cold War. To start those discussions, they met in Helsinki, and obviously they weren't going to agree right off the bat to reduce the availability of nuclear weapons in either country. We'd spent 2 decades based on the concept of mutually assured destruction. What they started with in Helsinki was agreeing what they did agree on. They identified where were they like-minded, where were they able to say, yes, this is important to both of us, both of our countries, and work forward from there. The Helsinki Accord is an example of a mental model. And mental models are what we're referring to today by quoting folks like Cynic and some of the other leaders. Mental models are what help you think about the world differently and help engage you in a transformational learning experience. The last area is personal traits. You might want leaders in your organization that are inspirational, well-spoken. The points of the Scout Law: trustworthy, loyal, helpful. All of those things are ways of expressing values. There's no right way, and you can mix and match what you consider to be values. I go back to the Dallas Fire Rescue Department because they're one of the organizational leaders in modernizing their fire department. These are the values that they believe in: integrity, dedication, diversity. These are things that you could probably take this same slide and say they're important in your organization also. You can't value everything, and you may value many things, but figuring out what are those values that you're going to focus on can help identify how your organization is going to move forward. It can identify behavior that is or isn't acceptable. I mentioned about how you can use the vision in performance reviews. You can use the vision to help your direct reports set goals. You can also use the values as a way to ensure that people are exhibiting the behaviors that are important to you and your organization. Values might be a part of that evaluation process also, where you provide organizational values that your team helped develop, or the values that your team agreed that are going to be an important part of your organization, and then have them identify how do you operate in your area of responsibility with integrity. How do you inspire dedication in your teammates? How does your day-to-day work demonstrate diversity? One of the companies that Ryan and I interact with a lot is Darley. Darley is a third-generation company based out of Itasca, Illinois. They have two primary customers. I'm not going to tell you who they are, but you're going to see who their customers are in the video that we show you. Their values are integrity, customer focus, relationships, teamwork, empowerment, recognition, innovation, and celebration. I also sit on the advisory board for half of Darley's product lines. And when you walk into their facility or you interact with one of their employees, they exude these values. I met with two of their employees 5,000 miles from their company and had lunch with them. And these two people that I'd never met before and had never met me cultivated a relationship with me based on respect, talked about how they operated with integrity. And I asked them some questions to understand how Darley operated this way. So the video that we're unable to link to right now from Darley shows that they primarily work for two organizations. They work for the fire service and they work for the US military. They allow those two customers and the needs of those customers to drive everything they do as an organization. If you ever visit Darley, when you walk in, you're given one of these sets of cards. Every employee carries a laminated card like this in their pocket. How do you keep the values of your organization in front of your employees? This is one way, and it's a way that works for Darley. This way, it's not just hanging on the wall in the entryway, it's a part of what they do. Okay, we've got the video fixed. Here it is.
To those who do the hard work, day after day, who don't do 9 to 5, who never know what the day may hold, to those who risk it all, who carry us when we can't walk, who run to face danger. They call you first responders. We see you as much more. For us at Darley, you're our inspiration. You've set the bar. You're our guiding light in all that we do. Your courage gives us our strength. Your sacrifice gives us our purpose. You have shown us the meaning of integrity to act ethically, and to do what we say we are going to do. Your dedication has given us the passion to think of your needs first and to place service to you above all else. You have shown us the value of relationships built on trust and respect. Your family has taught ours the importance of teamwork and created a culture that empowers us to make decisions on what's right for you. Your selflessness fuels our drive to innovate new technologies and solutions that allow you to carry out your missions better, safer, and smarter. Your victories are our rewards, which we cherish and give us the greatest sense of satisfaction. For over 100 years, your example has shaped who we are. We are Darley. Trusted worldwide since 1908.
Darley in general and Paul Darley, the current CEO specifically, are an organization and a person to whom Ryan and I look up. When we were first developing the idea for this presentation to talk about these topics, I sent Paul an email. I said, hey, could my friend and I come up and visit you? We'd like to get your feedback on an idea that we have. And Paul's response was, absolutely, let me know when. Here, the CEO of one of the largest fire service and military contractors in the country wanted to know when was good for us, not a list of, well, here's who you schedule with. And we worked directly with Paul to set up a time. He made the time for us to be there. And when he first showed us this video, it resonated with Ryan and I that the words that are used in that video are the same words you saw on this value card. Every one of those blue words was mentioned as a part of that video. And that's how Darley has their mission, vision, and values come through. When you walk into their facility, you're greeted by visuals of the company products, and anywhere there's a fire product, talking about their firefighter side of the business, there's also a military product focusing on their warfighter side of the business. That's throughout their entire building, their entire facility. Down in the basement, which is where their large meeting room is, there's one thing in particular that's worth mentioning. It's a fire engine, and it's the original fire engine that Darley manufactured. In 1908, there was a gentleman named Henry Ford that had just started making a car, the Model T. Ford was competing against others that were already in that space selling cars. Similarly, Darley was competing against others in the space that were already making fire engines. And in order to keep Darley out of that space, the other automobile manufacturers wouldn't allow Darley to put their fire pumps on those manufacturers' chassis. So Darley's great-great-grandfather, Paul Darley's great-great-grandfather, reached out to Henry Ford. And Darley put their Darley fire pump onto a Ford Model T chassis. And that was a union between those two businesses that kept both in operation through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. The last part of mission, vision, values, and methods is the methods piece. You're probably familiar with whatever your organization's mission, vision, and values are. But methods are not often talked about. And the reason we want to hit on those is because they're the how that Simon Sinek mentions. The methods are what are the specific things your organization does. For example, in public safety, we tend to operate in small units. In higher education, we operate in small units. Some of our small units might be a college with 1,000 employees and 10,000 students, but that's still a different unit. Within those colleges, there may be departments. Within those departments, there may be specialties and other functions. But think about what are the methods that you use to lead your direct reports. What are the methods that are in place that your boss uses to manage individuals and lead individuals at your level? What kind of rank structure or hierarchy is present at your university? What is the culture of your organization? And it's important when we talk about culture that we're going to think about it not as a purely negative thing. A lot of times when culture is brought up, it's brought up from the standpoint of it needs to change. Here's the bad parts about our culture. But culture can be a positive thing too. And it's important that we look at both, because as human beings, we're wired to intuitively look for the negative things. What's the dress code? What's the uniforms? Think about how schools, especially private schools, when they want to build that theme, that teamwork in between individuals, they dress everyone the same. Dress codes have the same effect. Think of your favorite sports team. How do they look? That's a method of portraying that mission, vision, and values. In the fire service, one of the methods we use is housework, where we have individuals perform cleaning tasks. I believe we're the only profession besides the housekeeping industry itself that has to clean their own toilets, make their own beds, and take out their own garbage. And lastly, one of the methods in the fire service is doing vehicle checks. Think about what the equivalents are in your organization. What are the methods in your organization you use to accomplish your goal? It might be regular staff meetings. It might be different trainings that you have within the unit. But consider, what are those methods that you use to reinforce your values, to lead your team towards your vision, to achieve your organization's mission?
Oh, go back. No. All right, so we were going to be doing an activity. Since everyone's online, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So what I'll have you do is just, I'll give you kind of the framework of the activity, and you can do this on your own time after the presentation's over, or whenever you find time to do it. So the activity would be, we wanted to capture the mission, vision, values, and methods for your own organization. So we were going to have you write down off the top of your head, and hopefully without looking at a website or a, some other cheating method that you might have, to look at the mission and vision and values of your organization. But just off the top of your head, can you determine what the mission, vision, and values for your organization are based on the methods that you've employed to be able to build that for your organization? So if you don't have one, we encourage you to look into that and start to understand how that can actually influence the people within your organization to move in the direction that you're wanting them to, based on the mission and vision, and then what values you have in place to set yourselves up to move in that direction. Again, since everyone except for Annabelle, of course, is on Zoom, we'll go ahead and skip that. We're hoping that you will take advantage of that a little bit later and follow up on that. We do have a quick note in the chat box. We talk about mission at my institution often. We ask about it in interviews, require new staff to attend mission orientation and reflect on it yearly. Wow, that's really great, Kayla. I guess as a follow-up, and if you want to try to unmute yourself, I don't know if that's even possible with the setup we have currently, but you can try. If you want to expand on that, if you have any vision or values that you guys use, and then kind of what methods. Obviously, I see the methods that you're using right now is just kind of talking about it within the organization during orientations and different trainings and stuff like that. Are there any other ideas that you could share with the people on the presentation today that might assist them in helping develop those?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, wonderful. I think that we're probably a very unique institution in this way, that we have an entire office of mission and identity that thinks about these things all the time and is constantly reflecting on how we can incorporate the mission into our work, both for our staff and our students. So it's like like I said, it's one of the first things we ask about in our interviews. Part of the final interview process is all candidates write an essay about how their position and the work that they would do at the university is aligned with the mission statement and the core principles of our university. And so it's really something that's at front of mind for folks often. And I think that might, like I said, might be unique, both because we have staff who are dedicated to it, and also because we are a faith-based institution. That is a specific narrative that we often focus on, or thing that they're focused on. Our mission isn't necessarily all about the faith-based, but it is intertwined with that, and a part of that conversation. But it's been very helpful because a lot of the things you're talking about, those are all front of mind for our staff pretty often.
Kill, that's really interesting to hear. You also have one of the few universities in the state that has a 4-year fire science program. I've done some work with that department, and having been to the office there, I didn't know that there was that back end and that degree of importance at the university level, but I can certainly see from my experiences there how that's kept front of mind. And also, something else you said that I want to call attention to is that it's updated yearly. That you not only have folks that are dedicated to making sure that it's a living document, that mission, vision, and values, but also that it's a current and important part of what you do. Is it connected back to employee development or employee annual reviews too?
Yeah, it's a part of the conversation we have in our performance reviews. When you set goals, part of them is thinking about how you're either living out those values or principles, or which ones you want to grow and expand in. All of the decisions that are made at meetings, and even things that I know our leadership does, they often come back to those values, right? To be able to point to the decisions that we're making and how they're tied into those. So we talk about it all the time, which I think is really great, because like you said, there's lots of places where you have a value somewhere, embedded in your website or on one wall, and no one really knows about it. And that is definitely not the case here.
We did this this is a short version of a 3-day workshop we do on these topics. And when we did the workshops last week, no one in the room could tell us what their organization's mission statement was. And one of the students, I still smile thinking about it, he goes, "I think we got an email about this." So the mission, vision, and values of that organization were about as important as where do you park, and other things that are really not a front and center aspect of the organization. So it's what you have at Lewis is very unique.
Do we have any other input on that, or anybody else on the Zoom care to share? If you do, go ahead and either type it in the chat or unmute yourself, and we can kind of keep this activity going, which is kind of shocking to me. I'm loving it right now.
I was gonna say Bob is from SIUC.
Okay.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Okay.
And this is, I think, could be said of any state school, and no disrespect to the leadership. It seems vision and mission statements change perennially every 2 to 3 years. It's recapsulated, redefined, or rebranded. So it almost seems to go in cycles. Internally, we meet once a year for a week and look at what our vision is and what our goals are, and review it from last year. But from the upper administration, sometimes those get handed to us, and they're tied to performance evaluations through HR that we don't fully get to decide. For AOD stuff, we have much more autonomy in what we're doing, but I think sometimes due to the levels of administration, the spirit and the effectiveness of these things get lost in the rubric, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, at one of our other presentations that we've given on this, we had somebody else say that their organization is directed by an elected position. And so, every 2 years, that leadership could potentially change. And in with the new leadership often comes these new mission and visions. And so it's like, they really have a vision, but it's really only about a 2-year vision, because they don't know when the next time their vision is going to change, which kind of makes it hard to say that that is a true vision, because as we'll talk about here in just a little bit, those ideas should span a lot longer than that. And, the decisions that you're making daily, the decisions you're making monthly, and the decisions you're making yearly should all kind of coincide with some of those missions and visions that you've set up, and then obviously encompassing those values that you have for each. So that was great. If does anybody else have anything to add? If you do, go ahead. And
Bob, while we're waiting to see if Rodney wants to weigh in, would you mind saying more about the comment you made about how you have more autonomy at the AOD level? Do you guys have a separate mission or vision just within that function at the university?
Well, a couple levels. We have an AOD team that's more of system-wide, and we meet with School of Medicine, individuals from our office. We're in counseling and psychological services, and we have a doctoral program for AOD. And then we also have people that are represented from the medical clinic, from the police, DPS, and from Student Rights and Responsibility, and then from the Rehab Institute, from the rehab major. And we talk about what we're doing in there and evaluate. And we've, as an AOD mandated provider, and then also for non-mandated services and wellness as well, we have a fair amount of autonomy. I mean, we do have transparency. We bring it to the stakeholders, and we do have to review it with our supervisors and up the chain. But I don't feel like we've got much pushback related to operating and coming up with our own goals and visions of how we want to do that.
do they at all compare as to how your mission, vision, and values coincide with what it is for the larger university, or is that kind of just still pretty autonomous and up to you?
I think there's some overlap with that.
Okay.
I mean, their goals and mission statements for sure have to be a part of our vision. But I think ours is more narrow, related to what services do we want to provide? What do we think is the most meaningful interventions? What does the student body want? What's the feedback of the student body on their wants and needs?
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm loving the amount of collaboration you have. I have, some of you are maybe familiar with another speaker that has done some IHEC stuff, and then also just he's kind of known for this stuff. But Dave Clausen and I have done some presentations on building that community and being able to find the right people. And we actually talk a little bit about that. Me and Brian talk a little bit about that in this presentation in the longer class about, who we inviting into that house. So when we have a decision to make and that type of stuff, who's getting invited into the space in which that decision is being made. because that's really important. So I'm really happy to hear you say that you have that collaboration, and then also that you're, something else that I wanted to point out, that you sound like you're really doing well with it, is just getting that feedback from people and trying to understand, are your mission, vision, and values really being put forth and showing as your organization does work. That's super, super important. So it's really nice to hear you're saying that. So it sounds like you guys have a pretty decent, at least with your more, critical AOD component there. It sounds like you guys are on the right track with that. So that's really good to hear. If there's no other comments, we can go forward here. So we wanted to talk a little bit about managers versus leaders, and everyone has this idea of what is their perfect leader look like. What's their, the boss, the one that you answer to, and things like that. And we want to talk about the differences between those two words, because there definitely are differences. When you look at managers, you're looking at people that they do things the right way, and that's good to do. But leaders, we want them to actually do the right thing. So managers basically are telling people to do the things the right way. There's black and white for them. Leaders just want the right thing to be completed. Okay. Managers enforce rules, but leaders really model those rules. We talk a lot about how the do as I say, not as I do kind of mentality comes in a lot of times when we're talking about heads of organizations or leaders within that organization. And we want to enforce the idea that, or reinforce the idea that, they really do have to model those rules in order for them to be accepted within that organization. If they're just enforcing the rules, not only are the rules a little bit more trivial, but the consequences followed by the violation of those rules can also be called into question. And then that's where you kind of get this dysfunction status that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. We want to coach and mentor, not drive. So managers are constantly driving their employees and their workforce to get the work done and pushing them to do things that maybe they don't know if they can do or don't have the skills or the equipment to do. And I know that's been a big problem in law enforcement, especially with, at the state level. Oftentimes who are passing down the rules and the changes to law enforcement as a whole is the legal system and the legislators and things like that. And as they pass those down, what they're doing is they're driving us in law enforcement to get more training and more, time in the classroom and things like that. But they're not really telling us how to do that. And that's one of the biggest problems is there's a lot of drive there, but there's not a whole lot of coaching or mentoring. And they're also not really supplying the funding to do that. So they're requiring all these additional mandates, but there's no funding to go along with it. And when you do that, you're not really setting somebody up for success. Managers are explaining things, but leaders want to inform and teach. You really want to have that teacher mentality, that idea that we can lead you into this and we can show you how to succeed within your job or your profession. I have a specific example with one of the officers that I work with. She went to a sergeant and she said, "Hey, I have to impound this car." She's a newer officer and she came in through the time frame of COVID and things like that was going on. So she was kind of coming in at the tail end of that, and she needed to impound a vehicle. And the sergeant said, "Oh yeah, that's super easy," and went down this huge list of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on things that she needed to accomplish in order to impound that vehicle. Well, the problem with that is she had not really done that previously. So for her to be able to get that all done and remember everything that sergeant had explained to her was going to be incredibly hard. Whereas if that sergeant would have taken the time to actually speak to her and maybe show her how to do it and teach her a little bit, or even find somebody else that could model those examples or model that behavior, and maybe get a senior officer to kind of take her under her wing and possibly show her exactly what goes into it and kind of take her step by step. Instead, he just kind of explained everything, and later had a conversation about that with him to kind of identify the fact that, hey, this may not have been the best way to go about this, and we should think about some other things maybe. With managers, they know how it's done. They get it. Just like that sergeant, he knew exactly how to impound a vehicle. He knew all the steps that went into place. And a lot of times they're built up, managers are built up within the organization itself, and they kind of understand how things are supposed to happen. Leaders actually show how it's done. They'll do a portion of that work, or they'll provide the example for the person that they're showing how to do that work. They actually provide that example and allow them to see how it's done. And then the last point there, managers, their word is go, and leaders is let's go. They want to go together. And that's where this next slide comes into place. We have this mission with the boss on top there. You can tell there's a couple different things here that are coming into play, but with the boss, he's elevated, he's in an elevated position, he's being carried by the rest of his team, and he's telling them what to do. But with the leader, you've got the leader out front pointing in the direction and doing some of the work as well and carrying that mission forward. And that's something that I really at least caught on to when I was doing the research for this, is I wanted to make sure that we provided people the tools and the education to kind of be that leader and show up first and give the people that they're working with the example of how it's done and how they can join in to assist or help with that mission. So leadership lag time is something we talk about with the health of the team, and how we can honestly walk into an organization and kind of measure how successful that organization is between the time when people notice that there's a problem versus when they share that with the leader. And that's the leadership lag time. When is an issue or an organization or an issue or a problem presenting itself within the organization, when does that actually get to the leader of that organization? When do people feel comfortable talking about this issue with the leader, sharing those ideas and thoughts? And then when is the leader actually taking a stance on that and bringing it back to the mission, vision, values, and methods of the organization in a way that can actually shape that organization and bring it back to where it needs to go if there's a problem, solving that problem. And this is something that we see a lot within the organizations, especially with, and I'm sure everybody on here is familiar with just the gossip or the basically water cooler talk that can be had within organizations that cause these issues to come up. And it seems like the leaders of the organizations are oftentimes the last to know. And we're trying to kind of get to the point to where leaders have communicated to the point where they understand there's going to be issues within their organization that do occur. But it's a process, and we need to get on a process in order to solve those issues and problems as they come up, and not months later, because the longer they fester and the longer they sit within that organization and the longer that lag time, the bigger those issues become, where they can actually derail some of the mission, vision, and values of that organization. So teams move at the speed of the leader. If you're the leader, you're going to set that pace. You need to be in front, driving or pushing that team and pulling that team in the way of the mission, to where you can actually guide that team to the goals that you want to achieve as the organization. And when we look now, we go from kind of leadership, we move to a different topic of decision making. And decision making is incredibly important in the overall success and well-being of the organization. When we look at the three main components that we've identified here, and then we'll bring in the communication piece a little bit later, decision making is one of those three main components that we've decided and through our research have kind of identified as one of those key things within the organization that keeps it moving and keeps it on the right track. So as we're going to introduce that to you a little bit, we have to understand, when must you make the decision? So how much time do you have when you're making the decision? Is this a hourly decision? Is this a, in the next couple minutes? Do you have a couple hours? Do you have a couple days or even months to make this decision? Where does that fit in on that path? And that'll kind of give you a couple different options on how to start to decide that. With the types of decision making that you go down or decide to use, we have a couple that we're going to talk about today. There are lots more that we usually expand on within the 3-day seminar, but today we have a little bit shortened time. So we're going to just talk about a couple different types of decision making, recognition prime decision making, and also naturalistic decision making. We'll kind of understand how the brain works and why those two types of decision making really make up a good portion of how people decide when it comes to issues. And then we're going to look at some of the factors in decision making. We've kind of coined this phrase of RAY, the responsibility, the authority, and the expertise to make these decisions. So who in the organization has the responsibility to make decisions about what's happening? Okay, whose job is this basically? But we want to kind of express that there is a responsibility upon everybody within the organization, maybe not to make individual decisions, but to support those decisions and to work within those decisions and things like that as the leaders of the organizations kind of pass those down. Then we have the authority. If you have the authority to make those decisions, then that's great. But what if you're not there? What in the absence of that decision maker or that leader within the organization, what happens to the authority? Where does it go, and who else inherits that authority in order to make those decisions? And then when we talk about the expertise, who is it within the organization that really has the expertise within that decision? Oftentimes in law enforcement, there are many situations where the sergeant on the shift will actually turn to an officer and say, what should we do in this case? Because the officer has a lot more expertise in that specific area than the sergeant may have. And so that's something that we kind of learn about, we break down, and we kind of talk about that a little bit more. And then whether the decisions are being supported, or are you supporting them, or how is that really working out? And we'll kind of expand on that a little bit later. And then we have a couple decision-making models that we'll introduce you to based on some of the research that we've done, and hopefully that'll help you understand. I'm going to pass this back off to Brian, and he's going to talk about the clock calendar compass.
The clicker goes back to me because this is a picture from my office, because this is a concept that really has been a part of my decision making for the past 20 years. This goes back to how much time and when you need to make a decision. Coming from a fire service background, not everything's on fire. And we often use that euphemism of putting out fires around the office. That's what I used to do, literally. And my mindset became that everything needed to be put out like it was a fire. And I use this model to challenge myself to think differently. Because some things, you're going to be looking at the clock. You've got a decision to make that you have hours to make it in. You may have minutes to make a certain decision. Other times, you're just going to circle a date on the calendar. We're going to make this decision. We're going to make it over the course of 4 meetings once a week. And this decision isn't going to be made until July. So it's important as leaders that we think about how much time we have. The other piece is the compass. And I know that you don't use a compass to tell time, but the compass is there because sometimes we just refer to our vision and we focus on moving in the right direction. The compass is not going to tell us when we get there, but the compass will help make sure that we're moving in the right direction. The other thing in the top right of the photo, I don't know if you can see it, it's under the chat box, is the fire alarm. That's the fourth kind of time version thing, is sometimes you have an issue that has to be addressed right now. And as leaders, there are things we simply cannot tolerate in the organization. Inappropriate comments towards others. People that are working contrary to our values. Those are things that need to be addressed quickly. We can't use the compass to address inappropriate or rude behavior. Those are things that have to be confronted right away. Similarly, there's times that we have to be comfortable slowing our decision-making down. There's an international group that I chair that makes decisions about training and certification for organizations worldwide. And I generally take 3 months to make any decision that's going to impact the credentialing process. And in that 3 months, we'll have an email or a Teams discussion about it. We'll have discussions in person. We'll have virtual meetings. But I make sure that everybody has their fingerprints on the knife, so to speak. Everybody has a chance to be heard, with the understanding that just being heard doesn't mean we're going to do what you say. And that's part of that art of leadership, is identifying that we want to make sure everybody has a voice and all ideas are heard, but not necessarily that every idea is going to make the final cut. That's where transparency, and one of those values that Kayla, I think you mentioned that earlier. How we make decisions is important, and how we show people we make decisions is important. And slowing those decisions down when we can, but making decisions quickly when we must, is a way to build credibility as a leader in that area. There's two primary types of decision-making we're going to touch on. First, we'll talk about recognition prime decision-making. Recognition prime decision-making is when we have experience in a particular area, and we're going to rely upon that expertise to guide our decision. An example of this is, if you're in a situation that you've been in before, you have kind of a slide deck or a Rolodex in your head that you can turn to the slide, or you can turn to that card in the Rolodex that fits the situation you're in. This is commonly used in high stakes areas. And because we typically do a lot of work with public safety, this is the one we start with. For firefighters and police officers, there's not always the time to weigh all of the factors to make a decision. So you have to rely on, this looks like an experience that I've had before. The positive of that is you can start more quickly making an action. The downside is you have to be continually assessing when you're making a recognition prime decision, because there may be differences in the situation than from last time you applied. An example that Carl White, the psychologist, uses is that a group of firefighters went in on the ground floor of a house, and there was a fire directly in front of them. From there, they put water on the fire. Spoiler alert, most of the time it's that simple, but the fire didn't go out. They put more water on, but the fire didn't behave like it was supposed to. So the officer of that fire company made a decision that everybody needed to leave the building and regroup because something was different. The slide and the actual experience weren't lined up. So he pulled the crew out, and within minutes, the floor that they'd been on seconds before collapsed into the basement inferno. What had happened was a fire was below them, had burned through the floor, and they were putting water on the fire that was burned up through the floor, not on the source of the fire itself. So they weren't making a difference with putting the fire out. That's an example of where recognition prime decision-making started them down the right path, put water on the fire, but they had to adjust their plan because it wasn't completely what was expected. We use recognition prime decision-making every day. There are certain things that we react to based on we've done this before. And it can be everything from habits that impact how we drive, what kind of cues we respond to, or how we feel when something comes on. The other type of decision-making we're going to talk about is naturalistic decision-making. Naturalistic decision-making is a slower, more deliberate process that's focused on making a good decision in a real-world, complex, and dynamic environment. I use the tree slide here because with naturalistic decision-making, it's more like growing a tree, maybe one of those oaks they use to refurbish the cathedral, and less about putting out a fire. There's not the urgency to make a decision, so you can be more deliberate. You can be more descriptive to identify what the issue is. You can examine different solutions and then involve your team in selecting what the best solution or what the best outcome is. What that will allow your team to do is see that transparency in decision-making. You may need to narrate for your team that, okay, this is a decision where we're all going to weigh in, and here's what the process is going to be, as opposed to an emergency or recognition prime decision-making where you're not going to have that more deliberate democratic process. So these are two examples of types of decision-making. What we also talk about are the factors that drive decision-making. Ryan touched on the idea of the RAY, responsibility, authority, and expertise. And this is a concept I like talking about with Ryan because it was born out of our two professions not playing well with each other. Chief Ray Kay in the Orland Park Fire Department near Chicago came up with this concept after 9/11 because he noticed there was conflict when it came to a chemical release. Fire department said the fire department was in charge. The police department said the police department was in charge. And Ray was looking for a tool that could build a mental framework or a mental model that could change or transform the thought process they were using at emergencies so that it could be collaborative for the response instead of competitive. So the three ideas are pretty straightforward. Who has the responsibility, the authority, and the expertise? Where this came into play with chemical releases are that there was concern over, well, what if the chemical release was intentional and there's a bad person involved? Who has the responsibility? And working with this police department, Chief K identified that sometimes the fire department had responsibility and the police department was in support of the fire department. Sometimes it was the other way around. If there was a criminal act, there may be parts of that criminal act that need to be addressed before you can deal with the emergency that the fire department is trained to do. So that idea of responsibility helps figure out who should be in charge. Similarly, who has the authority? If it's a criminal act or an intentional fire, the fire department has the authority to put the fire out. That's found in the Illinois compiled statutes, that's in the state law. The fire chief also has a responsibility to investigate all fires that happen in their jurisdiction. That leads us to the third point. That fire chief, especially on smaller and volunteer departments, may not have the expertise to do the investigation. Here in Champaign County, if the fire department doesn't have the ability to do their own investigation, they acknowledge that while they have the authority and the responsibility, the expertise might lie with the state fire marshal to send an investigator. That expertise might come from a multi-jurisdictional team made up of folks from surrounding counties, or that expertise may come from law enforcement if there's a significant arson loss, or in the event that there's a major injury or a fatality as a result of the fire. So the idea here is that we can use this model along with the idea of supported and supporting to figure out who should be in charge, who should be leading the discussion, and who should be making the decision. The idea of supporting and supporting came from that Marine colonel I worked for. One of the things that Colonel Janey was involved with was transferring Marines from Navy ships onto the shore to go to work. The conflict was, at what point is the Navy in charge? And at what point is the Marine Corps senior leader in charge? The supporting idea came about to identify when does that transfer happen. In the case of the Marines and Navy, they would identify that after 50% of the Marines are off the ship, it would be the Marine officer on land who was in charge of getting everybody else off. But they might have a contingency plan that in the event those Marines went ashore and they were under fire, then the officer on the Navy ship would stay in charge until 75%. The important thing is that decision was made and agreed to by all the players before the first Marine left the ship. I use a picture of something being flown in by a crane on this slide, because when that happens, there are 3 people involved. There is someone where the item is picked up, the crane operator, and then someone directing the crane operator wherever the item is going to be put down. Initially, the person who is directing the pickup is being supported, and the person who is going to receive this piece of material is supporting. There's a point where once this piece of concrete is rigged, lifted up in the air, that person at the lifting point is going to point to the person on the receiving end, and those roles are going to shift. The person who is supported becomes supporting, and vice versa. That's important because who the crane operator needs to pay attention to has changed. Once that piece is up in the air, he needs to pay attention to the person where it's going, not to the person where it came from. There's going to be decisions in our organizations that we don't make, but we have to support. And Randy, because you mentioned you work with the College of Medicine, there's a famous case study that looked at how CAT scans transformed medicine. CAT scans, the computer-aided tomography, was the first innovation that needed somebody else to interpret it. Up until that point, if a physician wanted blood work ordered, they could order the blood work, get the results, and they were trained to interpret their own blood work. If they wanted an X-ray, they'd order the X-ray. The X-ray would be typically printed on a Kodak plate. The results would be brought to them. They'd put the film up on the box, light it up, and they would do their own interpretation about what the X-ray told them. The same was true for other tests that were performed directly on the patient. What changed with the CAT scans was that someone else had to operate the machine. Someone else had to help the physician interpret the results. That really shifted the dynamic because suddenly the physician wasn't in charge of everything. The physician wasn't the expert on everything. The physician had to be supported when they were getting that information, and they were supporting that CT technician while they waited for those results. Then when they had the results, they went back into the role of being the decision maker. There's going to be times with your teams where you get to make the decision. Other times you have to support the people that are making the decision. And you need to identify which of those roles that you're in. Also going back to that healthcare example, are you treating a symptom or are you treating the problem? Are you treating the underlying disease? If I have a lung infection, if I have pneumonia, you can give me medication that's going to help with my cough, help with my fever, a bronchodilator that helps me breathe easier. But if you don't give me something that's going to kill the bacteria in my lungs, all you're doing is masking the problem for a short term. Can you think of a time that that's happened in your organization, where your organization basically put a Band-Aid on a bullet hole and didn't address someone's behavior? or didn't address a broken procedure in the organization. Or that sometime where your organization just did what you've always done, even though it's a behavior that no longer fit the way the problem presented itself. So it's something else to be mindful of, that we want to make sure we're fixing the root causes and we're not just addressing a symptom. If it's an employee behavior issue, we want to make sure that we're investing enough time to understand why an employee is acting the way they are. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it can help us identify the right resources to help that employee perform the way they're supposed to or behave as is expected in our workplace, aligned with that mission, vision, values, and methods. Another idea is making sure the right person is making the decision. That same Marine Colonel gave me a great example about, I was allowed to bring my monkey on my shoulder into his office anytime I wanted. That monkey was a problem in the workplace. I could bring my monkey in to see the colonel whenever I wanted. He gave me that permission. But he told me he's going to give my monkey a peanut, but I can never leave my monkey in his office. His point is, the problems that I'm supposed to solve at my level are my problems to solve. And the problems or decisions he needs to make at his level are his to solve. I can't have him solve my problems. I can't give him my monkey unless I understand that I'm giving up doing part of my job that I'm supposed to do. The message he wanted me to understand was that I'm welcome to come in and ask questions. I'm welcome to come in and learn how he sees a problem. But we're going to have a dialogue about how to solve that problem. That dialogue is him giving my monkey a peanut. That dialogue is not him telling me this is what you must do. As my leader, he would use questions to guide that discussion, to help me make sure I was addressing the problem, not the symptom, to make sure that I was operating within my responsibility, authority, and expertise, and make sure that I knew if I was supported or supporting someone else in that situation. You have monkeys. Everyone that works for you has monkeys. By working in the AOD space, we're dealing with people that are our customers that have their own monkeys and their own issues. We can't solve their problems, but we can give their monkeys peanuts and help them solve their own problems. The next factor to consider is that you have to acknowledge there's a decision to be made. There's plenty of examples of when a decision should have been made, but a leader chose not to and chose to stay the course. That Kodak example is a great one. The Kodak model of you buy the camera once and you buy all of their disposable products for the rest of your life stopped working as early as 1975, when the first digital camera was patented by Kodak. There are similar stories with situations that occurred in PepsiCo and General Electric. Both of those companies noticed that the market was responding to their products differently. Some of the GE products that were being sold were no longer being purchased at the rates consumers had bought them in the past. And similarly, Pepsi noticed that their market share had started to decline in the late 80s into the mid 90s. The CEO of Pepsi aggressively reached out to people within and outside of the organization to understand why were there fewer Pepsi products being sold. By asking that question, she learned that consumers were becoming more health conscious. And this was at a time when there was Pepsi, Diet Pepsi, and a very small array of other Diet Pepsi products. Not Diet Pepsi brand, but other things like Diet Dr. Pepper, Diet Sprite, and other things that were in the Pepsi family. This led Indra to identify other spaces where people were drinking. That's the idea of something called positive deviance. She worked to understand if people weren't drinking the Pepsi products that were sweetened with corn syrup, what were they drinking? And she found that water was an increasing thing that people were drinking because it was perceived as healthy. Energy drinks weren't a part of Coke or Pepsi's portfolio yet. They existed, but they were all sold by smaller companies like Gatorade. Drinks with amino acids, energy drinks, were also coming into the marketplace, but they weren't available from the two big beverage companies. So what Indra Nooyi did was started to purchase these smaller companies and diversify Pepsi's product line. This is where I would normally do a show of hands and ask how many of you drank from a garden hose and still survived your childhood. And I'm raising both of my hands. This was where bottled water became something that was an integral part of our society, where we stopped drinking from the tap as much as we used to because of the marketing and that breadth of products that Pepsi was producing. Why fill up your own water bottle when you can just grab one out of the refrigerator? They sold us on the convenience. Coke was slower to respond and had been playing catch up with Pepsi for nearly a decade after Pepsi started going into those other markets. And it's all because of the approach that the CEO of Pepsi took, acknowledging that there's a decision. Eventually, Coke caught up to Pepsi in that regard. With General Electric, they failed to acknowledge how much competition was coming from overseas. At the end of World War II, there wasn't the infrastructure in Japan to produce goods cheaply and effectively. The same was true throughout the entire Pacific Rim. They had some of the largest populations in the world and some of the greatest technical expertise in the world. But their infrastructure was in a shambles as a result of World War II, a shambles that took decades to overcome. General Electric didn't appreciate that they were losing market share as factories in the Far East were getting rebuilt. They never asked the question, why was their market share going down? They decided to respond by laying people off, curtailing product lines, and doing things that were the opposite of what Pepsi did. Instead of asking questions to understand why this was happening, General Electric just accepted that this was happening and led them into bankruptcy. So it's important in a leadership role that we're in tune with what's happening in our professions. It might be that there's a new way that people are taking drugs. One of the other topics that Ryan and I talk about, with my background as a nurse and his background as a drug educator, is how people are taking different drugs and what are drugs being cut with. In the AOD space, it's important that we acknowledge how different things that products are cut with has an impact. Drugs are now being cut with Benadryl, with fentanyl. And unfortunately, quality control in street drugs is significantly lacking. So there's a decision that you have to be looking for those cut products, those expansion products, as part of the treatment or as part of the treatment plan that we put in place for an individual's primary addiction. It may not be just the heroin or cocaine we're addressing, but there may be a Benadryl or other underlying addiction that's caused by what the drug is mixed with. Good decision-making also means we have to consider and actively not make a decision. Coke didn't make a decision, but it wasn't an active decision. It wasn't an active thought. They just didn't make a decision. Similarly, General Electric's decision was to not make a decision, to not pull at the thread and understand why their sales were faltering. In our organizations, not making a decision needs to be considered. If an employee is a good producer, but has some aberrant behavior in the workplace, we have to decide to make a decision that we're going to confront that behavior. Think about how many times in your workplace that hasn't happened. That instead of confronting an aberrant behavior, it's decided, oh, you know, that's just Fred, and that's how Fred is. I know that Fred shouldn't say some of those things about different people. However, we're going to let Fred say that because he's our #1 salesperson. That's an example of accepting the costs of not making a decision. Or if you have someone in the workplace that likes to yell, likes to scream, likes to be very animated, the cost of not making a decision to address that behavior might be that you're going to lose other employees by retaining a high performer who's running others off. So part of our decision making is we have to consider what happens if we don't make a decision. For the last part of this section, we're going to look at 2 techniques to help you make better decisions, to give you a takeaway. One comes from Susie Welch. Susie Welch suggests that before you make a decision, especially a decision that's going to have a long-term impact, ask yourself, how are you going to feel about this decision in 10 minutes? How are you going to feel about this decision, or what is the impact of that decision going to be in 10 months? What is it going to be in 10 years? This works especially well in our AOD space because this interrupts our thought process. We're going to talk in the culture section about how we can't control the environmental cues that lead to habits. So we may have folks that we deal with, and we may identify that first thing I do when I get up in the morning is I have a cigarette. First thing I do when I get up in the morning is have an alcoholic beverage. First thing I do when I get up in the morning, and if you didn't identify with the first 2, I probably got you here. The first thing I do when I get up in the morning is look at my phone and check email. Those are all examples of addictions. And yes, I can say you're addicted to your phone. I'm a doctor, not the kind that helps people, but the way this works is when that cue, waking up, happens, by putting in a decision-making process, we slow down our brain's reaction to that cue, and we introduce the possibility that we could do something else first thing in the morning. So this thought process is similar to what Mel Robbins, the motivational speaker, uses in her 5-4-3-2-1 behavior change model. The idea is that you are slowing down the time in between the cue and your body's response, or the routine that you enact because of that cue. So this works to help people change behavior, whether it's an addictive behavior that's healthy or unhealthy. This helps reframe that by slowing down your thought process. Next idea comes from Gordon Graham. Gordon Graham is huge in the public safety space. He tries to get public safety folks to understand that we typically don't train enough to make decisions that exist in the high risk, low frequency category, that we don't train enough for those decisions. So 6 suggestions he has in that space are: make sure you're going back to your policies. And if there's not a policy, do you have time to write one or consult with HR or find out what other people are doing? Find out how a particular problem has been solved before in your unit or at your university. That's the past practice piece. And in higher ed, we typically have to deal with different CBAs or bargaining agreements that can impact how a problem is solved or how a decision is made, even if there's not a policy for it. We have a joke in the fire service that once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is a tradition. And those traditions can become grievable if you're not aware of what your predecessors have done to make a decision. Has the company been here before? Has an issue happened at your university previously? In many organizations, it's happened before, and there's probably a rule named after someone. You just need to seek out enough guidance to know how has this happened before? How has this behavior been addressed elsewhere? And that's where having a network of peers at your university, at your level, can help you. Are there ethical concerns? especially Randy working in the medical space, more than other professions, medicine brings in the idea that there are ethical concerns that have to be addressed as part of our decision making. What are the consequences if we get it right? What are the consequences if we get it wrong? And lastly, make sure we're documenting not only the outcome of the decision, but how we got there, especially with things that might turn into a legal issue or a dismissal issue later. Our last decision topic is something called decision fatigue. Decision fatigue, there's 3 examples we're going to give you. The first is, where is the candy at the grocery store? Yes, it's got its own aisle, but you're going to find candy and magazines and children's toys at the checkout. This is on purpose. This is because people involved in marketing know that you're going to go into the grocery store and you're going to buy the vegetables you need to buy because the vegetables are right by the door. And when you look at the vegetables, you're going to decide if you want the bag shredded lettuce or you're going to buy the head of lettuce and shred it yourself. Are you going to buy the bag of broccoli that's already cut? Should you get it frozen instead of raw in the vegetable section? Are you going to go and buy broccoli florets or broccoli stem and cut it yourself? All of those decisions take brain power. And what the people that put the candy and the magazines and the kids' toys at the checkout are hoping is that you have used up all of your decision-making ability before you get to the checkout. So that whatever you see at the checkout is going to be what you purchase next, because you're tired of making decisions. Picture Steve Jobs, the former head of Apple. What is he wearing when you picture him? Annabelle's closing her eyes right now, and she's picturing him wearing a dark turtleneck and a dark pair of pants, because that's what he wore every day. The simple act of picking out what clothes are we going to wear each day and what does something match uses precious brain power. I got help this morning so I could be at my best for you. I'm wearing a new pair of pants, a nice pair of chinos I bought, Costco, 14 bucks.
Nice.
But I wasn't sure if they'd look okay. So I had to parade myself in front of my wife and make sure, hey, do I look okay? Yes, I am 50 years old and still have to get permission to leave the house if I'm dressed in something I haven't worn before. Steve Jobs shortcutted that potential problem by following a routine. This is why you have great ideas when you're driving or when you're in the shower, because your brain is on autopilot and you're making fewer decisions. What does this have to do with the court system? There's been 5 studies now in 5 different countries that looked at when people are paroled, not when based on how much time have they served, not when based on have they made amends for their crime, but when was their hearing? When did the parole board hear their case? And in every one of these studies, it was proven that when people are paroled, didn't correlate with the crime. It correlated with when did the parole board last have something to eat or drink. Snickers has the idea that you get hangry. They're on to something. Because from this decision fatigue research, if you're going to be the person who's up for parole before lunch, you're better off waiting till right after lunch, or you're going to be in jail for a longer period of time. Because when our brains are tired and we have to make a decision, we err towards the status quo. The parole board erred towards not releasing someone because they felt that was the safer decision to make. That was the easier decision to make. Steve Jobs wore the same clothes every day, same outfit, different clothes, so that he didn't have to waste brain power making those decisions. And think about it when you go to the grocery store next. Think about how you feel at the checkout. Think about the cover of the Inquirer. And if you really need to know if Elvis is an alien or not, because they're banking on your curiosity and banking on you being too tired with the cart full of groceries to not learn more about him being an alien. From here, we're going to talk about organizational culture.
We're going to dive into organizational culture and exactly what makes up the culture and how it's, changed and things like that. But the first thing we want to start off with is just this quote from Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's one of our favorite quotes from him, based on the idea that if you do not have the people that you're working with and for, if you don't have their attention and their ability to follow your leadership, all of a sudden, the culture of the organization and of those people will eat all of your strategy for breakfast. It will all go out the window immediately. So we tied into either a police or fire situation. And so for this, if there's a fire inside of a building and you tell the people that you're working with, let's get in there, and they don't understand why, or they don't necessarily have the culture of the let's get in there mentality, what if they don't go in? What happens? What if you say, hey, that fire's too dangerous, but they have a culture of let's get in there and put this out? What happens then? So we have to understand which direction the culture is facing, even when we're developing our plan or our strategy for how we're going to approach different changes, new implementations, new ideas, things like that. So when we're looking at culture, we're going to obviously define it first, okay? Then we're going to look at a couple different models of culture, and we're going to break them down. And we're going to understand where culture actually comes from and how we interact with it. We're going to look at the different aspects of culture and how they're built, how they're established, and then how we interact with them, and then the changing of the culture, which is probably the hardest part. We all have been in those organizations and those spots in our workplaces or lives where there's an established culture that's happening. We want to identify where are those places in which we can actually start to influence that change to develop either a new culture or maybe just change the current culture in the slightest bit. So the first thing we want to do is identify what is culture. So this is another kind of one of those activities that you guys could participate in if you were here, but you're not. So we're going to just kind of leave it up like we did before, and hopefully we get some input from either the text boxes, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and talk about what culture means to you, that's great. We'd like to hear from you. We'd like to see what you believe culture is within your organization and how it's built, how it's made, and how it interacts with the different employees. Give it just a couple minutes here and see if anybody's got anything in the chat box or want to share. Not seeing anything, we'll kind of start our own conversation here, because actually prior to the getting on, oh, sorry, currently. So, oh, yeah, no problem, Bob. You take your time. We had a discussion in the room prior to getting our technology issues sorted out, and we were talking about how culture is built within organizations, and we were actually talking about some of the recruiting techniques and retention and how that looks within the organizations on, what we're doing to bring in new people and how that interacts with the culture that's already established within the organization and how we want to possibly change it or grow that culture into the future. So if Annabelle has any ideas, I'd love for her to key in on this and let us know some of the ways that she believes culture is built within organizations and then maybe how it's grown. Annabelle.
Thank you. Now. I think the baseline, I mean, it deals with your people. It's like those shared values come together to become what is the shared experience, or how do you come together as a team for that environment? Because when I think of culture, I don't just think of like shared beliefs. I think it's also the shared responsibility, the teamwork method. I think what goes into it is more so the mentality side of it. How do you agree to come together? And then also what's like the shared standard almost, what's going to be the baseline for how you interact with each other and how are you going to like implement that in the workplace.
That's great. I like that a lot. She has not seen our next slide, but she actually just talked a lot about our next slide. So I'm going to go and throw that up and talk about our definition of culture that we're going to kind of identify as one that we've accepted. And culture is all behaviors, ideas, attitudes, and values shared by a group that are transmitted to new and future members of that group. Culture is influenced by history, uniforming, facilities, vocabulary, leadership, and management within the organization. And so something that she had mentioned was just kind of how that all comes together and how people are able to put their ideas and attitudes forward, which is exactly kind of what we were talking about here. And we think that that's a really important idea, is that culture is not just what you have, but who you're bringing in, what kind of new things you're giving to the group or you're introducing to the group is all going to change that culture. And we're going to eventually kind of talk about that butterfly effect, how, the butterfly effect, how a butterfly on the other side of the world can flap its wings and we can feel the wind on this side of the world. That's that change. That's that one little thing happening that we can either introduce or develop into the culture that then we can foster and let grow and keep coming back to. And that's, again, kind of how the culture identifies itself back to the mission, vision, values, and methods that we were talking about before. Some of the methods that you're going to be using to build those mission, vision, and values come back to the culture that you've identified. Because like I said, if you have a leader that's saying, get in there and fight that fire, and you got a whole bunch of firefighters on the other side saying, well, we don't really want to go in there and fight that fire. We haven't built that culture. We haven't built that trust and respect for the leadership to know when we should be able to go in and that type of stuff. Those conversations get a lot harder. So let's unpack this a little bit. A group's behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values. Okay, we've talked about that again. So what are they doing? Not just who they or what, what's our mission or values that we put up on a poster board that we hang in our lobby or something like that, but actually what are the behaviors of the group? How are they influencing the day-to-day operations of what's happening within the organization? What ideas do they have, and how are those ideas interpreted or heard? And we'll get into the communication piece here in just a minute, but understanding that there's many people that build up a culture. There's not one individual culture. That's the values of that individual, or the morals, the ethics, whatever, of that individual person. A culture has to be two or more people, and that's the space in which two or more people understand that they're in the same space and they're collaborating on what that space is going to be looking like. So the ideas that are shared within that group builds that culture. The attitudes that people have when they step into work, how are you showing up? When you step into work every day, is the attitude that you're bringing to work, is that in line with what your mission, vision, and values are saying about your organization? Everyone has hard days. We all understand that. We don't expect people to come, every single day to their organization and just have a great time and everything's going to be hunky-dory all the time and no issues. But we got to understand what attitude they're bringing into the organization and how that may influence the culture. So maybe we come up with different ideas on where to send those people, or what jobs that they need to do on certain days based on maybe how they're coming into the space, and giving them space to also kind of understand their emotions and what they're feeling, and then how they incorporate back into the organization's mission, vision, and values. And then what each individual's values within that organization, how they all kind of combine. Are they bringing in the values into your organization that your organization has established is good for them? And so when we talk about things like recruitment, who are we recruiting and what reasons are we providing them to be recruited? How are we identifying what we do within the job and how that matches up with the values that we're looking for with the applicants? And I think it was said before, that was a great comment before about how in interviews coming into that particular organization, they actually talk through some of the mission, vision, and values that they have within their organization, and actually see how the applicant has tied in their personal values with what the organization stands for. We're also going to be looking at what's transmitted to new and future members. Okay, so again, this goes back to that kind of recruitment, but now we're talking about the retention piece as well. So when somebody new comes into your organization, what are we giving to them as the organization? What are we providing to them and showing them, modeling to them? What kind of values and culture are we expected to have within this organization? Is it okay to talk about another member of the organization in a negative way, or is that not acceptable in your organization? And how are you communicating that? How are you transmitting that to these new people and the future members of your organization? And then the last thing we want to talk about is just influenced by history. So what has been done? What's the past practice within your organization that causes people to remember those things and causes that culture and that influence of the culture to move in the way of what has happened? Is that important in your organization? Do you carry that history with you? Is it easy to forget where you came from or how it used to be or things like that? Or what are we doing with that history of the organization? Kind of uniforms. Brian talked earlier about the uniforms that you may have. You know, Steve Jobs wearing the same outfit every day to not use that brain power. That kind of goes into that uniform thing. People knew what to expect from Steve Jobs when he showed up. And like I said, that attitude comes back into it. So what attitude are you giving out? What ideas are you pushing forward with the clothes that you're wearing, or the it doesn't have to just be uniforms, but other things that you're bringing into the workplace? What do your facilities look like? We have a newer facility that I've worked with and that I worked at that when I was in that facility, I mean, it literally looks like a jail. There is, well, I'm a law enforcement officer, so I guess I have worked in jails, but there's another organization that I worked for and with that they almost had no windows in their building. They were in almost a basement area where the very little natural light came into that space all day long. And so what kind of facilities do they have, and how is that influencing the culture within your organization? Do they feel like they're in jail every time they come to work? Hopefully not. But if that's what we're, you know, communicating with the types of facilities and maybe even the decorations that we provide within that facility, those are things that can influence the culture over a long period of time. The vocabulary that we use. I love when people come to the University of Illinois and I'm on campus and we're discussing something and I say, oh, just go to the ARC. They have no idea what the ARC is, but in the culture of the University of Illinois, the ARC is the Activities Recreation Center. So that's where you would go to work out or something like that. Similar, we have other buildings that we use acronyms for, where outsiders coming into our culture may feel more like an outsider within the culture because they don't understand the words or the acronyms that we're using. So what kind of vocabulary are we, using and utilizing when we're talking to other people, when we're communicating with them? Are they from within the organization, or are they from outside of the organization? And then the leadership and management styles that we provide to the people that come into that organization, whether they be an employee, a visitor, or somebody that's maybe a patron of your organization, depending on where you work or what you're doing. These things matter, and they all shape and influence how the culture is seen, not only from the inside, but also from the outside. So we're looking at principles of world-class cultures here. And what we've identified is really just 4 different kinds of things here. We need it to be anchored to the mission, vision, values, and methods that are identified by that organization. When it's anchored to those ideas, they really, really can thrive. And that's when the culture buys into the ideas that we've identified here. The alignment around the strategy, culture, results, and execution all are there. And so with the people within your organization and the ideas that we have surrounding that, is everyone in alignment? Do we have a consensus on which way we're moving forward, especially for like the vision piece where it's in the future, far into the future? Do we have alignment in that? Do we have alignment how we're going to get there and what we want as a culture and how we're going to develop that? We're gonna avoid hiring for those missing skill sets. So we're gonna leave anybody that doesn't have and follow the values and the culture within our organization. If they don't have those, we're going to leave those aside, but then we're going to hire into the company the ones that we're missing. So the values and the ideas that we put into place within the organization, we're going to go out and actively look for people that have those skills. Maybe we're coming up short in a specific area within our organization, and we need more of a standout power within that skill set. We're going to look for those people individually. We're going to find the people that will fill in the gaps within our organization to provide us a more well-rounded organization. And then we're going to communicate this across all levels, all ideas of the organization. And that includes all 3 levels that we've kind of identified, being the individual level, the team level, and the whole organization level. So again, we want to see what individuals fit into the culture, but then what teams we can develop. So who can we collaborate together to create that better idea, that better culture? And then how do those teams and individuals enhance the overall culture of the organization to become the organization that we're looking for? I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Brian. He's going to go over Hofstede's onion model a little bit.
So you may have seen this before in terms of national organizational culture, but it's the idea that values are that nucleus, are the center point of what our organization does. And what our organization does is the practices. Also part of this are the rituals. What are the things that are a part of our organization? What do we do every day? If you've ever been to a Walmart, a shift change, there's everybody put your hands in briefing where they do a little cheer. Those are rituals that are part of that organization, and it's a way that that organization's culture comes through. On the police and fire side, there may be a briefing at the start of shift with a brief report of here's what happened the day before, here's what you need to do today, as a way to make sure information doesn't get lost in between. Who are the heroes of your organization? Now, heroes don't need to be somebody with a cape and an S on their chest. Heroes are, who are the examples of doing it right that your organization points to? Who are the people that your organization holds up as examples of this is someone that exhibits the values of our organization? This isn't something that needs to be done on a daily basis, but this is where identifying what right looks like and pointing out people that are doing it right in your organization is important. Lastly, what are the symbols of your organization? Like, coming from the public safety side, there's patches and badges. On the higher ed side, at the University of Illinois, we changed our logo from this white eye that looked like a column on a blue background to an orange eye about 10 years ago. However, you can still find that old symbol multiple places around the university. It's important that when you change a symbol like that and you want to move forward, you have to get rid of all of the vestiges of that symbol or all of the older representations. So if your department is going to have a logo, if your medical school, Bob, is going to have a logo or a brand, or Kayla thinking about what the Lewis University brand looks like, those are distinct identities, and you don't want to have multiple versions of that identity out there. It's one thing if there's an old one and somebody has a collector's edition. It's another when your symbols change. Hofstede was famous for working for IBM in the 70s and 80s. And his job was to help prepare people that were going to work overseas to go to other countries. And he did that by interviewing people and their families that had come back from those countries. Based on those interviews, he identified that there were 4 major dynamics that led to a comparison between the US and other cultures. Those listed number 1 through 4 on the screen. He later identified short versus long-term orientation. That was more when there was, when IBM expanded into the Far East in the 70s and 80s. And most recently, he identified the idea that some societies were more indulgent or focused more on disposable things, whereas others tended to delay purchases more. The one we're going to talk about out of these 6 is collectivism versus individualism, because in our workplaces, that's one of the biggest ones that has an impact. Individualism is the extent to which people feel independent, as opposed to being interdependent on members of a larger group. In the US, we have more individual competitions. Even within team sports, we've identified who is the most valuable player, who is the top of that profession or in that field. We tend to focus high on individualism. This is one of the things that's driven everybody getting a trophy in recent years, because we want to give credit or identify that everybody is unique and everybody is important. The downside of that individualism is it can take away from interdependence. It can take away from the collectivism idea that we have to function as members of a society as a whole. Part of the challenge with being highly individualized came through during the pandemic. We didn't look at getting vaccinated or wearing masks in terms of how it helped other people. Many were only interested in how it helped themselves. Because of that, it was harder to get people to change their behavior to focus on things that would benefit others and not directly benefit themselves. It was a fight to get someone who had a cough to wear a mask or stay home if they were sick, because they were only looking at it from their perspective, that individual perspective, and not what is good for the society as a whole. In the Far East, they wear masks every fall when flu season comes around. They're a much more collectivist society. When I visited China in that lighter pink, when there's an outbreak of influenza, everybody wears a mask, not just people that have symptoms. Those people don't even leave their home. However, in the US, is a highly individualized nation that work for what you have, that hard work is rewarded, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. We encourage people to come to work when they're sick. Not all jobs have sick time. So while an employer might not say, you need to come to work, even if you have an infectious disease you can spread to others, that wouldn't be a value that a company wants to really advertise, especially in food service. But what they are saying is, we're not going to give you time off if you're sick. We're not going to give you time off if your child is sick. So as a result, you're going to have to come to work even when you probably shouldn't be here. And that kind of thinking is prevalent in the darkest colored purple places on the map, which is the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It's found in a couple places in Europe, but not to the extent that we have in North America. So that's one area that how we view culture and the things that we value as a culture, as a country, can work against an overall view. Ryan, I like the idea that culture is how members of your organization, members of your university talk about your university with their families around the dinner table. How do they talk about the decisions that your organization made today, this month, or next week? Can you talk about those decisions in an open forum at work without getting criticized, without getting in trouble for questioning an idea? One of the topics that we talk about when you can't do that in an organization is the idea of dysfunction. Dysfunction is an idea that you can't discuss undiscussables in the workplace. And here's an example of what we mean by that dysfunction.
If I am giving level 10 access to someone who is not demonstrating level 10 responsibility, maybe they're only demonstrating level 3 responsibility, right? The distance between the access that I'm granting them and the responsibility that they are demonstrating, that distance right there, that is where dysfunction grows. That is where there's chaos, right? And that's where a boundary is needed. Now, here's the mistake I used to make. I would go, okay, I'm giving level 10 access. This person is only demonstrating level 3 responsibility. So I know what I have to do. I have to put a boundary on them to force them using external pressure to increase their responsibility up to the level of access that I've granted them. So we can have a conversation with someone and request that they be more responsible. But if they are unwilling or incapable of anything more than level 3 responsibility, us putting a boundary on them is only going to cause more frustration. You see, we cannot possibly permanently change another person by using external pressure. Now, think about today, if someone had a cardiac event. Obviously, those of us who know how to do CPR, we would rush to that person's aid. And using external pressure, we would apply that pressure to make their heart beat and to create a change in their situation. But at some point, if their heart does not start to quicken and beat on its own, you cannot permanently sustain that change using external pressure, right? Never have you seen two friends walking around a mall, one doing chest compressions on the other, and think, wow, that's a sustainable, healthy relationship, right? No, but I know the desperation. I know the desperate feeling of something's got to change. And you know that it's the responsibility this person is not bringing. That's what's got to change. And so most of us just stay stuck in this frustrating place. We know that changes needed to be made. We make the changes that we can make. But in a relationship, if the other person is unwilling or incapable, then that's where that weird dysfunction starts to happen.
We think that that's a good description of that. And also Elaine's dancing is definitely dysfunctional. But treating something abnormal like it's normal leads to workarounds there. So we talked through earlier about how if, Fred is doing something abnormal in the workplace, but everybody walks around and says, oh, that's just Fred, then that leads to the workarounds for the other people within that culture to do things that are against the norm and cause dysfunction and cause chaos within the organization. And so we've got to stop dancing with that dysfunction, and we have to start confronting it and understanding that we don't need possibly more boundaries. We need to understand where people are at and work with them. So the dysfunction cycle that we've identified within organizations is dysfunction. It leads to the chaos within the organization. And the chaos leads to this need for order. So what is the leader going to do to reestablish this order that's that's needed within the organization because of the dysfunction? And then the need for order leads to additional boundaries. We've all been part of those organizations where one person does something and all of a sudden everyone gets an email that says we're now no longer allowed to do X, but they never say why. Well, we all understand why. It's because Fred is why. Fred is the why. That is why we have these additional boundaries. But instead of introducing that issue and talking through that issue with the person that's bringing the dysfunction, we're adding these boundaries. And then the additional boundaries leads to more dysfunction within the organization, because now all of a sudden everyone's looking at these new rules and they're saying, why do we even have these? Why do I have to do this? This is not something that I've done in the past. This is not an issue that I brought to this organization. This is something that's being thrust upon me because of somebody else or something else. I'm going to pass it real quick back to Brian. He's going to go through this idea for you.
Dr. O'Neill is one of my heroes. He's a hero of the fire service at large. The picture is him receiving one of the most distinguished national awards for leadership in the fire service. And one of his quotes that I love is that you get the behavior you tolerate. He talks about how organizations often know who is not behaving appropriately, but the leaders, by addressing or ignoring that behavior or addressing it as a blanket email to everyone, condone certain behaviors. Organizational culture is shaped by the worst behavior that leader is willing to tolerate. One of the examples we use is, okay, what time are you supposed to be at work in the morning? Ryan and I work in public safety, and to us, if you're not 15 to 30 minutes early, you're late. There's other people that their shift starts at 7, so they're going to be here at 7. It's not a written rule that says you have to be there early, but if I don't come in early, the person I'm relieving might get sent on a late call. They might have to stay later. They may have to not get their kids to school on time, all because they had to go on a late call. Now that is part of their job. But if I could alleviate some of that stress on them and create a culture of teamwork by coming in early, I'd rather do that. Well, let's say that person who's supposed to be ready at 7 shows up at 7:01. Then the next shift at 7:02. Then it's 7:03. Then they show up at 7:04 because you didn't say anything about showing up at 7:01, 2, 3, or 4. Now, I'm going to see if it's okay to show up at 7:05. Or let's take it out of the workplace and bring it to our kids. If curfew is 9:30 and my son's not home until 9:35, but I'm just so happy that he's home and he's safe, I don't say anything. The curfew is now 9:35. Even though we've agreed that it's 9:30, I've given that latitude to 9:35. The next time he comes home at 9:40. Well, his thinking it's only 5 minutes after 9:35. And my thinking is 9:30 is what we agreed to, but hey, still pretty close, so I'm not going to get upset about that. The next night he comes home at 9:45 and I lose my mind because, Mitchell, why are you getting home so late? We agreed on 9:30. And what's his response going to be? Well, we agreed on 9:30, but 9:35 was okay. 9:40 was okay. So 9:45 must be okay too. That's the culture I established between he and I because I allowed him to be late that first time and didn't address it. And I allowed him to keep moving that by 5 minutes. We can do that knowingly or unknowingly with our employees. Where we want to go next is changing culture. How do you get people to change and do something that the organization needs to do that they may not want to do? This goes back to the diffusion of innovations curve that Simon Sinek had in his video. It actually comes from Everett Rogers' 2003 book, Diffusion of Innovations, which is a study of how does new technology enter the workforce. And what Sinek circled but didn't really explain well on his chart is that chasm, that gap between the early adopters and the early majority. You're going to have this in your workplace. If you have 100 people that work for you, 3 of them are going to be your innovators. And as soon as you announce there's a policy change, they're on board. Heck, they want to know what's going to change so they can start changing to it now. Then you have the early adopters that as soon as it's rolled out, they're going to do it. They're not going to give you pushback. They're not going to wait to see what anybody else does. That chasm is the hard part to cross. Because until you've crossed that chasm and you get the majority of the workforce involved, 70+% of the workforce is not going to engage in that new behavior. So for us as leaders, having a strategy for how to change decisions, understanding why people resist changing, and how to change things effectively is a key part of our roles. To talk about how we change, we have to understand that our brains are working against us every single time we want to change something. Every single time we want our workplace to do something differently. Every single time we want to change a habit, our brain says, nope, not today. And that's because of these 4 structures of the brain that are evolutionarily mission critical to us surviving as a species, but also significant barriers to us advancing as a species. First is the amygdala. The amygdala is the chicken little part of your brain. That's the part of your brain that detects the slightest thing that's different in your environment and triggers your fight or flight response. Your amygdala sends neurotransmitters from your brain to a gland on top of your kidneys. And Bob, I'm nervous because I don't know what specialty that intern who's in your office has. Hopefully not a nephrologist or endocrinologist. But it sends a signal to your adrenal glands above your kidney that releases epinephrine or adrenaline. Adrenaline sends more blood to the smooth muscles of our body. It sends less blood to our skin, which is why our hair stands up on end when we're afraid. It sends blood to our brain, our heart, our lungs, makes our heart beat faster, makes our heart beat stronger, makes us breathe deeper, sends more oxygen and glucose to our brain. All of those things happen because the amygdala detected a change in our environment. That lasts for 60 to 90 seconds. That fight or flight response lasts a minute to a minute and a half. One of the ways that our body reacts to that fight or flight response is to feel anxious, feel angry, be fearful. If you're still feeling angry more than 90 seconds after something triggered you to be angry, you are making yourself stay angry. Because those chemicals, those neurotransmitters that make epinephrine and release it through your body are all broken down after 90 seconds. This is why taking a deep breath if you feel anxious. This is why interrupting an argument to say, you know, Ryan, let's take 5 minutes, go to our separate corners, and then come back out fighting. Because odds are when you come back out, you're not going to feel like fighting anymore. Because those chemicals that trigger that fight or flight response are no longer coursing through your body. The second structure is the entorhinal cortex. And Bob, I'm picturing you calling out on Skype to other people in the organization to come check my homework on this. The entorhinal cortex is the part of your brain that responds to physical patterns and changes in your environment. I shared a story last time we presented about where this worked against Ryan. We were staying in a hotel and it was not laid out the way his bedroom was laid out. So when he got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, he successfully dodged his bed, successfully dodged my bed, and then walked full steam into the wall and missed the bathroom by 3 feet. And just for purposes of our business partnership, that was Annabelle laughing, not me. His brain was following a physical map. His brain was navigating based on how the trip to the bathroom is in his house, not how it was in the hotel. To the credit of Ryan's entorhinal cortex, all subsequent trips to the bathroom at night were successful. Think about this if someone moves the furniture in your house. Hopefully your parents loved you more than mine loved me, because they would move the coffee table in the living room so that I would trip over it if I came home late. So even if they had fallen asleep, they had a marker for when I came into the house. My kids don't know what that's like because their cell phones have flashlights, and that trick wouldn't work on them. If you move somebody's workspace in the office, you trigger that fear response because this part of the brain doesn't know what to do. This was documented in the movie A Bug's Life, where the ants are walking in a line and a leaf drifts down into their path. And the ant behind the leaf yells, "I'm lost." That's what this part of the brain does. As soon as there's a change in the environment, it detects it and triggers a reaction. Moving somebody's desk can cause that. I don't know about some of you, but I'm at an age where I get upset when they move things at the grocery store because I know where they are. The next brain concept or part of your brain that works against you is your basal ganglia. This is a spaghetti-like lump in your brain that maintains your habits. This is the part of your brain that when you decide you want to get up at 5 in the morning and go exercise, this is the part of your brain that says, no, the bed is warm. We are not going to this gym place or person you keep referring to. We're going to stay here in bed. This is the part of your brain that you have to overcome when you want to do something differently. And that's where David Allen's work on creating habits, especially habits that help us in the workplace, come into play. Habits have 3 things: an environmental cue. It has a routine or how you respond to that cue. And then it has the reward. What do you get for engaging in that behavior when you respond to that cue? If the cue is your alarm goes off at 5 a.m. and your routine is that you don't get up, or you hit snooze 7 to, in the case of my wife, 23 different times, you're going to get the same reward. You can't really change the cue if it comes from your environment. Yeah, you can change the time on your alarm, but if there's somebody at work that has a habit that frustrates or enrages you, you can't just tell them to change that habit. You can't change the cue. The cue might be traffic in the morning and you getting upset at the traffic. You can change the routine. You can change how you work to it, how you respond to it. And sometimes you can change the reward. Maybe if I get up and go to the gym in the morning and go through my full workout, I can go out for lunch. But if I don't get up and go to the gym, I can't go out for lunch that day. I've got to eat a random can of possibly expired soup in the drawer of my desk. But that's where we can take a cue, plan a different routine, and how we reinforce that routine is the secret to us changing habits. David Allen talks about this in his book, Getting Things Done, and he takes the approach of this is how we do things better in the workplace. This is how we build better habits in the workplace. The last part of our brain is the habanero, not the habanero. This is different. This hurts a lot more. However, just like not eating a habanero, the habanero part of our brain wants us to avoid pain. That is its sole function, is to make us make choices that are easy. Yesterday, I went to the gym and it was leg day. Today, my legs hurt. Annabelle can verify that I'm not standing still very well. This part of my brain would say, you know what? Don't go to the gym because your legs hurt the next day. Tomorrow, my arms are going to hurt for the same reason. And that part of my brain is going to say, Brian, don't do that. It hurts. This is the part of our brain that we have to retrain and get it more comfortable that some pain is okay. Some changes are worth it. I'm going to poke fun at the fire service for a moment because we are notoriously difficult to try new things. Wherever you're located, you can go to the fire station and someone at that fire station will still be upset that the fire service got rid of the horses in return for motorized fire trucks. That's an exaggeration, but it fits this point. There was a study in 2005 about this helmet seen on the right. It's called the Gallet helmet. It is the helmet that every other firefighter in the world, and that's not hyperbole, every other firefighting organization in the world outside of the United States wears this helmet. And that helmet is worn everywhere else except in the United States because it's lighter. It gives you better visibility. It doesn't block your view if you look up because of the brim. If you get hit in the head with something, which depending on what kind of leader you are, that may happen more than you want. But if you get hit in the head, this helmet distributes that impact around your head better and reduces the likelihood of you getting a brain injury. It has a lower center of gravity, meaning that it puts less strain on your neck. The eye and face protection is integrated in the helmet, like a fighter pilot lens, so you can just pull it up or down. In a crash in the vehicle, it offers similar protection to a NASCAR helmet. When you're wearing a breathing mask, that mask attaches to the helmet to get a seal, so it only has to fit one way, as opposed to the current way of sizing masks in the US, which is everybody, every individual, gets their own mask because every face is different. You've probably never seen this helmet at use in your community. And you might be wondering why. Self, or Bob, or whatever you call yourself, why do I never see this helmet in the United States? The answer is because it doesn't look like the helmet that Ben Franklin wore. It doesn't look like the image of what US firefighters think a firefighter is supposed to look like. As a result, we cling to this helmet that has all of these negative benefits. We stick to a helmet with all of those negative benefits because it's not what we think Ben Franklin wore. That style of helmet in the US Fire Service vocabulary is called the Ben Franklin. Here's the crazy part. That helmet was invented 2 decades after Ben Franklin died. So unless they dug up his corpse, put the helmet on him and reburied him, never happened. But this image, this Currier and Ives print, drives what we think a firefighter looks like, to the point that in the US, we won't wear this helmet. And Bob, working at the medical school, there's plenty of other traditions. I'm sure you see people walking around in a variety of lengths of white coats at different times of the year. And
I'm mainly in the psychological realm. I'm in counseling and psychological services, but we're embedded in a medical clinic. But we definitely do see the similar type things in the sense of we've done a lot of things historically in the recovery community that haven't been evidence-based, because that's just what we've done historically.
As a nurse, that really resonates with me because so much of healthcare is practice-based. Yet outside of medicine, the corollary areas that actually provide the long-term support, like counseling, nursing, and other healthcare avenues, haven't had that credibility that our body of knowledge is as valid as the physician body of knowledge. We're going to talk about a book called Influencer and a model that this group came up with to change behavior. And it works because it breaks behavior change down into 6 areas. It looks at personal motivation and ability, and looks at those 2 areas from a social standpoint and a structural standpoint. And these folks, the influencer team, they are New York Times best-selling authors for not only how do you change behavior, but how do you get people comfortable having difficult conversations in the workspace. The way the model works, it's based on making the undesirable behavior, the change you want people to make, desirable. It makes sure that people have the ability to do what you want them to do. It harnesses peer pressure and builds peer groups to help individuals be successful. And lastly, it changes the environment. It changes the environment to reward people, and it changes the environment to ensure they have the ability, the reminders to be successful. We're going to look at this through the lens of one of my projects, which was to get firefighters to use baby wipes. I know, technical piece of equipment, no moving parts, soft on both sides, smells like aloe, or sometimes to mess with my fellow firefighters, I would buy the scented baby wipes. But the idea is that after being exposed to a fire, they would come out of the fire and use a baby wipe to wipe the soot off their skin. And we'll talk about why to do this as we unpack the model. On the personal motivation side, we want them to understand that firefighters are more likely to get cancer. Specifically, firefighters are 2.2 times more likely to contract cancer than any other occupation. Additionally, the cancers that firefighters are contracting are not the same as the cancers that are prevalent in the general public. There are higher incidences of specific obscure types of lung, thymus, throat, and reproductive cancer that are found in clusters in firefighters that are not found as widely anywhere else in any other occupation or in the general public. How's that for a motivator to change your behavior? Similarly, wiping away products of combustion from your skin before your skin can absorb them lowers that risk. I've never met a firefighter that's pro-cancer. I've never met anybody that's pro-cancer. But if it was as simple as knowing why you should or shouldn't do something, we could change any behavior easily. The reality is it's not. So addressing personal motivation is one of the first things we can do. Second, we need to make sure people have the ability. We need to make sure they know where the wipes are. We need to make sure they know how to use them effectively. I know, baby wipes, soft on both sides, sometimes smells like honeysuckle and blueberry. But we have to teach them, you're going to take the first wipe and wipe your hands. As soon as there's soot on the wipe, throw it away, get another one. Then do the front of your face from your hairline down to your chin. Sorry, it makes me nostalgic for when my hairline was a little lower than it is now. Then you're going to get another clean wipe. You're going to clean in your ears like your mother taught you. You're going to clean behind your ears. If that wipe gets dirty, get another wipe, and you're going to do the back of your neck. Then you're going to go back to your hands, do the back of your hands and go up your arms. This isn't rocket science, but we have to show people what the behaviors are if we want them to engage in. I use this same model at the U of I when we had to explain why we wanted certain behaviors during the pandemic. And we use this to help get people to wear masks and understand why wearing a mask was important. And it was difficult because we're trying to educate people in a way that was often contrary to the media messaging. On the social side, we have to make sure that everyone in the organization is modeling the right behavior. In the case of these wipes, we can't have the instructors come out of the burn building covered in soot, or the leaders come out covered in soot and not decon, but expect every student to do that or every firefighter to do that. We as leaders have to model the behaviors that we want to see. We have to make sure that whatever that new behavior is, it's a part of what our organization is. That whatever this change is, it's built into the organization's DNA, and we explain to people where it fits. It is very difficult for us to change a behavior compared to modifying an existing behavior. So adding a new behavior is more difficult if we can't attach it to something we've been doing before. So identifying where to get people to do something different is going to help you be more successful. On the ability side, we would, at the U of I, we had wellness ambassadors, and it took us a lot longer of a meeting to come up with that name than it should have. Wellness ambassadors were undergrad students that would walk around our most populated lecture halls outside of the lecture or before the lecture and give out masks. They wouldn't give them out by saying, do you want a mask? What they would do is take the mask out of the box and just direct it to the person and say, here's a mask. That had a greater impact on student mask wearing compliance than anything else we did, because it was peer leadership setting the tone for the right behavior. On the structural motivation side, add signage. You can still see masks in so many places you go, or signs telling you to wear a mask, signs telling you to wash your hands. I'm a little disturbed that people weren't washing their hands pre-pandemic, but that's what the signs are there for. Signage is reinforcing the right behavior. Think about the last time you used a public restroom, possibly in a restaurant. What sign was hanging up in that restroom? Employees must wash hands before they return to work. Is that because the employees don't know how to wash their hands? Or because the employees don't want to wash their hands? Not necessarily, but it's a way that we can modify the environment. In healthcare, there was a move about 10 years ago to add signs to patient care areas that said, it's okay to ask your provider if they've washed their hands. It's a way that the hospitals and the clinics added an external accountability system. Lastly, we have to make sure people have the ability. In the healthcare setting, one of the most difficult challenges with getting providers to wash their hands more was that older facilities didn't have as many sinks. Older hospitals have wardrooms where there was one sink, 30 beds. It was not reasonable or practical that during rounds, every provider was going to go and wash hands in between patients. However, in a setting where there are rooms and aren't plenty of sinks, that makes it easy to engage in the behaviors we want. So you don't need all 6 of those. What this group found through their research is that if you were to draw upon one behavior from each of 4 of these areas, you can have up to a 70% success rate. Adding 3, you were in the low 30s to 40s, but adding a 4th one, a 4th category, brought you up to 70%. Adding more categories after that appealed to different learning styles, and adding more things within each category helped people remember. And that's a great segue into our final area we're going to talk about, which is communication. Because until a message has been provided multiple times, that message may not be received throughout the organization.
So as we're connecting the 3 different ideas that we've talked about, effective leadership, decision-making, and organizational culture, it really is that communication piece that brings it all together. And a couple things that we're going to look at is just first off, there is a standard model for communication that we're going to show you and kind of explain a little bit. And then we're going to talk about this idea of message mapping. So the message model that we're really talking about here and we have to identify is that there are multiple pieces to this. And the first piece is the sender. The sender develops a thought and they encode that message into a system in which they believe the receiver of that thought will be able to understand it. They use a channel, whatever they decide, to transmit that message. As we've learned, certain messages are much, much better in person and from that person's mouth than they are through an email or a text message or something like that. So that sender sends that thought across to the receiver, and the receiver then receives it. They decode it with their own ideas and personalizations involved with that. And then they develop their own understanding of what that sender expected to send across. The big part here is the feedback. The feedback has to be available for both the sender and the receiver to be able to share what they thought they were sending and what they truly understood. To just give a very basic example of this, I have my two children, they're 4 and 6. And the other night I asked my 6-year-old to go brush his teeth. I thought I was explicitly clear in my instruction to my 6-year-old to go brush his teeth. He went to his room and decided to pick out his outfit for the following day. Upon trying to pick out his outfit for the following day, he realized that there were some hangers on the floor. So he picked up the hangers off the floor and decided to hang those up in his closet. Upon doing that, he realized he had a lot of space in his closet on the floor. So he decided to go out and grab some of the toys that were located around his room and go back into his closet and place those in strategic areas which he could get to them the following day and be very, very helpful with his playtime so that he didn't have to waste the time going out and getting them. At the time, he could do it ahead of time and really save some difficulty for himself, okay? So then he's in his closet rearranging his toys when I walk into his room 20 minutes later and say, Dylan, did you brush your teeth yet? And he says, no, I'm just about to do that. Me, as the sender, thought I was explicitly clear 20 minutes earlier when I told my son to go brush his teeth. He heard something completely different, then provided me the feedback. He thought I just meant eventually, before he went to bed, he was supposed to brush his teeth. That is the case, but not exactly. So I sent him some feedback that if he doesn't get in the bathroom and brush his teeth right now, I would take away every toy he owns. He understood that feedback. He understood that message, and he went immediately and brushed his teeth. So we got the message across eventually, but there's some difficulty there. There's some understanding that people don't always understand and receive the message the same way you think you sent that message. So the audience really drives the message and the medium in which you're sending the message. Are we giving the message to the public? Are these people outside of our organization that may not understand? And like I said earlier, when I have somebody new that comes into my organization and I say, go to the ARC, I think I'm extremely clear, but because they're outside of the organization, they may not necessarily understand what that even means. So we have to understand that who we're talking to, maybe in their public, they have to have some idea of what that message even means and what kind of medium are we sending it through. Are we talking to peers? Can we have inside jokes? Can we have things like that that we refer to that they immediately understand what we mean? Are they internal messages? So are we sending them just between our internal relationships, or are they going external? Are these public messages that we may be advertising for other people? The executives in the area, are they understanding what's happening and what kind of message they're sending and what medium they're sending it in? Or the politicians, we all have experienced that politician that gets up and says one thing but seems to be doing another. And so how does that confusion mix up the message that they're trying to send versus what they're actually sending? When we break it down, we look at Dr. Vincent Cabello came up with a couple different things here with the crisis communications and how we're talking through crises. Okay. We just understand where we're going to be using these types of things, and we have to develop certain message mapping is what they decide, or he came up with message mapping to decide how we can send that communication across and develop that clear communication through the crisis. So he talks about message mapping, and this is just a sample of the message map for smallpox. So keywords he put in italics, and he's got 3 messages that he wants to send across. Okay, so as you're putting this message together, you're understanding what your key messages are, and then you're supplying the supporting information for those key messages. How we do this is a little bit different each time. So with the 9 principles of message mapping we look at, we go to the first in timing. Okay, we have to limit the number of key messages that we're providing in a certain amount of time. We usually say a maximum of 3, no more than 9 seconds and 27 words to express that that necessary information. So we're gonna look back here, and we have these 3 key messages we're trying to convey. If you notice, there are not more than 27 words in there, and it doesn't take more than 9 seconds to convey each one of these messages. So that's what comes into importance with timing. People understand things when they hear them in this idea of chunking. So they're going to chunk those 3 messages together. They're going to understand the messages easier, because just like you remember your social security number, you don't remember your social security number all as one big long number. You typically will remember your social security number as 3, 2, 4. So 3 numbers, 2 numbers, 4 numbers. And that's how people's brains are able to hold that information for longer periods of time and understand it and break it down into easier methods for them to understand. The second thing we look at is the readability. So what kind of words are we using? Or what kind of messages are we sending? Are we putting them out in a way that any adult that sees this message, it really should be reading or hearing or listening to it from the perspective of a 6th to 8th grade education. So when we're sending across these messages, we want to send them across so that everybody can understand them, no matter what their level of education is. We want them to be simple, straightforward, and easy to understand. Then we talk about the serial position effect. The serial position effect is something that we talk about primacy. So primacy would be the first thing that you say. People remember that the most. Okay, so it's, if you have a section of 3 things you're trying to get across, you would make the first thing really important. You want that to come across first because they're going to remember that. Then number 2 would be a little less important, because then at the end you have this idea of recency. So primacy is at the beginning, they remember that the most. Recency, they remember that because that's the last thing they heard. And then the less important message fits somewhere in the middle there. So whatever you're deciding, however you're trying to push this message across to whoever you're working with, or whether they're being a team, as a coworker, or somebody outside of your organization, you want to push across the first thing that's most important, kind of add something in there that is important, but if they forget it, it's not going to bring everything to a halt. And then that last thing, that recent message, is also where you want to come into something really important that they need to remember, and that is the most important thing. Number 4, we look at citing credible sources. One of the biggest things we have right now is this idea that when people hear something, they don't have to understand it, they can Google it and get immediate information about it. But the problem with the internet is not everything you see on the internet is accurate. And it depends on where they're getting their sources from. their source of information. So where are they going to find their information? What kinds of sources are they getting their information from to provide you the feedback about your information? So if you use credible sources up front that people trust and people understand, they're less likely to question the material that's being presented to them. So as they look through that message, they'll have less to question on it, and they'll have more to just pay attention. This is a big one in especially AOD and other organizations that I've been involved with. We have to convey empathy, caring, and compassion. We have to let them know that we truly care about their situation, their struggles, the things that they're having problems with. We understand and we empathize with the issues or the problems that they have in front of them. And we are going to try our best to convey that to them so that they feel closer to us. They feel more of a connection and the ability to share these things with us. Especially as leaders, one of the biggest things we talked about previously is that kind of flash to bang kind of concept. So when is the problem, when does the problem present itself to the organization versus when does the leader find out about it? This goes along with that. If we can develop the conversations prior to the message even being going out, and we can convey that we have empathy coming with the message, people are more likely to understand it and accept that message as it comes across. Number 6, we want to use stories or meaningful analogies and graphics. There was a study done that showed using graphics or visual aids caused people to understand and recall that message by more than 50%. So if we can use some sort of graphic that connects with the message that we're applying, we can get people to see that photographic memory type of a situation where they can see that graphic and they can know what the message was based on the graphic that they saw. This is why when you go into elementary classrooms and all the letters are up on the wall, the letters are associated with an object, and that object is shown in a picture. So A is for apple, B is for banana, and it causes the students to also say those words, which is causing the sounds to come out of their mouth. That's an easier way for them to understand it. That's an easier way for them to recall that information, is to be able to see that graphic and use that graphic to recall what that sign is saying or what that letter is. We want to avoid negative words. Brian actually has a really good example of using negative words I'd like him to share with you now, if you can, with the airplane. You always talk about the airplane and using those negative words.
If you've been on an airplane recently, as part of that pre-flight briefing, the flight attendant gives you instruction and talks about what to do. They don't tell you what not to do, because our brain perceives negative words in a defensive way. They don't tell you to not bring your luggage with you if there's an emergency. They tell you to leave your carry-on baggage behind. The way we phrase things makes a difference, because using negative words triggers the amygdala, triggers those parts of the brain that generate a chemical reaction to resist doing what we're told to do. And at one point in our lives, we've all done something just because we knew we weren't supposed to. And that's the science behind why we do that. And if we use a negative word when we're mapping, we need 3 positive words to offset that, especially when we're in a crisis. And that, don't think of crisis as we're dealing with smallpox. Think of a crisis as we have to provide administrative discipline to an employee. We want to avoid negative language as part of that, because it's going to make them more defensive and less willing to change. Speak in threes. This goes back to it builds upon the serial position effect, where that's telling you to get the right 3. But speaking in threes is because when it's an emergency or when somebody is stressed, yeah, administering discipline isn't an emergency, but all of those brain structures that make it harder to learn are going to be firing in overdrive. By having 3 simple messages and repeating those 3 messages, Fred, it's not appropriate to use that language in the workplace. We understand that that might have been appropriate language for you to use at home while you were growing up, but we will not tolerate that language. Or if I want to phrase it without the negative, we avoid language like that in the workplace. Wherever you're using the message map, apply these principles before you need to. I've used these for employee discipline situations. I've used them for public speaking. I've used them in the example Ryan had, getting my kids to do things. Because at the 6-year-old level, they're going to remember up to 3 things. And sometimes you have to remind them what to do as well as what they shouldn't be doing along the way. Lastly, address someone's likely fears and concerns. This is what the Associated Press wants you to think New York looked like last week when the smoke was coming down from the Canadian wildfires. The air quality in New York has been worse, and not from Canadian wildfires. But if we're not making comparisons that people can understand, they're not going to take away meaningful information when the numbers don't make sense. If we tell them that the particles in the atmosphere was 160 parts per million, and the person on the news seems really, really excited about that, we really don't have context for how significant that is. But if we were to say that the particles in the air from wildfire smoke are roughly 1/3 the volume of particles that you inhale on a daily basis at ground level from taxi cabs, that makes a difference. That helps us understand what the actual risk is, what the actual problem is, and how significant it is. If we are giving someone discipline, we need to include in that what the likely outcomes are. Fred, if we don't see a change in your behavior and we don't see that change immediately, further discipline could happen. That further discipline could involve a written warning. It could involve time off. It could involve a discussion with your bargaining unit about your behavior. But identifying what are those likely fears and concerns that need to be addressed. With a lot of these, you could write them today. You don't need to wait for the next smallpox. You don't need to wait until there's a fire in your building to start thinking about what you're going to say. Because writing these messages, unless they're tailored to a specific person, you can write them in a broad enough way that they can be used for almost any event. Here's an example of that from 2001. This is the very first publicized very first press conference that was done on 9/11 by Mayor Giuliani. I want you to listen to how he conveys empathy and listen to the degree of specificity, or in this case, non-specificity he provides. He's asked questions that require a number answer, but he provides no numbers. So just listen to this clip. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you when these messages were written.
Good afternoon. Today is obviously one of the most difficult days in the history of the city and the country. The tragedy that we're all undergoing right now is something that we've had nightmares about, but probably thought wouldn't happen. My heart goes out to all of the innocent victims of this horrible and vicious act of terrorism, acts of terrorism. And our focus now has to be on saving as many lives as possible.
Do we know the number of casualties at this point, sir?
I don't think we really want to speculate about that. The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear ultimately. And I don't
Question
think we
was,
want to
how many
speculate
casualties are there? His answer was,
effort
what
now
do we
has to be
compare?
to save as many people as possible.
There have also been reports of large loss of life among the police and firemen who were sent there to rescue people. How accurate are those reports?
There is no question that we lost police officers and firefighters, and some that I know personally and all of us here know personally that we're very worried about.
Thank you, sir.
So with that example, it sounds like they were written that day, but in reality, those messages started being crafted in 1994 after the first attack on the World Trade Center, because they knew there'd be another attack on a New York City landmark, and they started building those messages. Working in emergency management, I have messages for the bad things I worry about happening to my campus, so that I have them in a binder on a shelf and they're ready to go whenever I need them. Are there any questions we can take from anyone? You can either drop them in chat, or if you're watching the recording, please send Annabelle an email, or you can reach out to us directly. My information on the left, Ryan's is on the right. You can just scan those, it'll take you to our contact information. What we've given you is an overview of these 4 concepts. We also have 3 to 4 hour workshops on each of these concepts, as well as a 3-day workshop where you will build your own message maps, build your own change plans, and apply each of these concepts back in your organization. And you can reach out to Annabelle for more information on hosting those sessions. On behalf of Ryan and I, we thank you for your attention today and look forward to following up with you in the future and helping you become more successful in your organization.
Thanks for attending. I'll pass it back over to Annabelle for anything.
No, that's all.
Okay. All right. I'll share and